It begins with silence, the kind of silence that hums before sound itself is born. In the void before earth took its first breath, before the light of any star struck the face of the deep, something already pulsed, steady, rhythmic, precise. The ancients said it was not chaos that filled the nothingness, but timing, a sequence too pure for mortal comprehension, set in motion by the one who would soon speak light into being. Long before the first sunrise, before dust and breath, time itself was measured by beings who never slept. They were the first witnesses, the watchers of the dawn, and they called it the calendar of heaven. It was no invention of man, no dial or sundial carved by human hand. It was a living rhythm, written not in stone but in light itself. Every orbit, every equinox, every pulse of creation followed a secret order, invisible yet absolute. The stars did not simply appear. They arrived in appointed places. The galaxies turned in measured spirals, each echoing a pattern that predated all things visible. Before we open today's scroll, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep these in-depth stories of faith, history, and mystery alive. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from. This channel has become a global fellowship of seekers, historians, believers, and thinkers united by curiosity. Now take a deep breath and step with me into the pages of time. In the oldest traditions, creation began not with explosion but with harmony. The heavens were tuned. The book of Job speaks of a moment when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. That shout, that chord of divine resonance became the first measure in the song of existence. The angels were its musicians. Their task not to rule, not to command, but to keep the music of creation in tempo. They were time's first guardians. Ancient mystics believed that every movement of the heavens corresponded to a heavenly choir, each star an instrument in God's vast orchestra. And within that music, the angels kept watch, counting the beats of eternity. They called them appointed times, sacred intersections when heaven and earth would touch. To them, time was not a line. It was a wheel, turning endlessly, returning to the same notes in higher and higher harmonies. From that divine wheel came the pattern of days and seasons. The first watchers, according to the writings of Enoch, were shown how light itself divided into measured intervals. 12 gates through which the sun passed each year. 6 ascending, 6 descending, balanced perfectly around the equinoxes. The stars were not random fires, but markers on a cosmic clock. Their rising and setting told of more than weather. They spoke of purpose, prophecy, and divine rhythm. For humanity, this order would one day be glimpsed in shadows, in lunar months, in solstices, in the cycle of planting and harvest. But what they inherited were fragments, echoes of the original music. The full harmony was lost when the first discord entered creation. For somewhere between obedience and pride, one of the watchers broke rhythm. Time itself was not destroyed, only divided. Heaven still kept its perfect count, but the earth began to drift. The ancient texts describe it as a rift between realms. What had once moved as one, heaven's calendar and earth's, now ran slightly apart like two instruments out of tune. Humanity could no longer hear the full measure. They began to build their own clocks, chasing the shadow of a perfection they could no longer touch. In Enoch's writings, we find a haunting echo of this moment. The prophet is taken up and shown the chambers of the sun and moon, each moving with precision under the command of angelic overseers. These, Uriel tells him, are the laws of the luminaries, the ordinances of light. Each gate opened and closed according to season, each beam of sunlight obeyed its appointed time. To disobey would be unthinkable, for in that obedience lay creation's peace. Yet down below, humanity began to measure time differently. where heaven counted by the sun's fixed path, a solar year of 364 days divided into 4 equal quarters, humanity began to follow the fickle moon. Lunar months shifted and drifted. Holy days wandered across seasons. The ancient Hebrew priests once kept the solar reckoning given to Enoch, but after exile in Babylon, lunar cycles replaced it. The stars above kept one rhythm and the world below another. That drift would shape the rest of history. Wars, feasts, even faith itself began to follow calendars that no longer matched heaven's pattern. Time became human property, taxed, divided, ruled. But in secret corners of the ancient world, a few remembered. They said the angels still kept the true count, waiting for the day when humanity would listen again. What if time itself could rebel? What if by turning away from the divine rhythm, the world had introduced a fracture not just in the calendar, but in the soul? The ancients warned that when the heavens and earth fall out of sync, disorder follows. Seasons twist, empires rise and crumble too soon, and prophecy becomes misread. The flood of Noah, the fall of Babel, the exile of nations, all they said were not merely punishments but consequences of being out of time. Archaeology has begun to catch up with what mystics always claimed. In the caves near Qumran, scrolls were found describing an ancient solar calendar preserved by a priestly sect who called themselves the Sons of Light. They claimed their reckoning was given by angels. Every season began on the same weekday, Wednesday, the day the sun was created, forming a perfect cycle of 91 days, repeated 4 times to make 364. To them, it was more than mathematics. It was obedience. They believed the entire cosmos was bound to this number, that it represented the hidden law by which God measured all things. They saw themselves as the last keepers of heaven's time. To abandon it was to invite chaos. Their writings lament the corruption of the lunar calendar in Jerusalem's temple. They accused the priesthood of walking in darkness because they celebrated feasts on the wrong days. To them, this was not a trivial error. It was a rupture in the covenant itself. Time, after all, was the first covenant made in creation. Let there be lights in the heavens for signs and for seasons and for days and years. When we forget how to count by that divine measure, we lose more than dates. We lose rhythm. We lose peace. Even now, every culture still tries to recover it, through solstice rituals, through atomic clocks, through equations that keep our satellites in sync. Yet somewhere deep within us, we still feel it, the unease of a world slightly out of time. Imagine for a moment what it means that angels once counted our hours. That time itself was not abstract but sacred, a song played by hands of light. Every sunrise, every heartbeat, every rotation of the earth was part of that cosmic melody. To step out of it was to lose harmony with heaven. Perhaps that's why human history has always felt like a race, a constant attempt to catch up to something just beyond reach. Some early theologians believed that the restoration of all things, the promise of redemption, would include not only the healing of souls, but the correction of time itself. The prophets called it the appointed day of the Lord, not merely a date on a calendar, but the moment when heaven's and earth's rhythms would finally merge again, and the music of creation would resume its full tempo. And maybe that's why these stories still matter. Because somewhere between sunrise and starlight, between ticking seconds and eternal stillness, we sense there is more to time than we understand. Every breath we take is measured by laws older than stars. Every dawn echoes a pattern first sung by angels. The calendar of heaven was never just about counting days. It was about remembering who set them in motion. To live by that rhythm was to live close to the divine. To fall out of sync was to forget where we came from. In the next part of this journey, we'll follow that rhythm as it descends into human history, into stone tablets, temple rituals, and celestial mathematics. We'll see how the ancients tried to map the invisible and how the angels' harmony became humanity's mystery. But before we move forward, pause for a moment. Listen, not to your clock, not to your phone, but to the faint hum beneath everything. That is the sound of heaven keeping time. The light that first tore through the darkness did more than reveal creation. It defined it. Every particle, every orbit, every living rhythm was measured by it. Ancient texts say that when God spoke the universe into being, He did not simply create space and matter. He measured it by intervals of light. It was a language of brilliance and silence, a divine equation where illumination became both boundary and bridge. The ancients called this the mathematics of light, a phrase that sounds poetic, but in their understanding it was literal. To them, light was not just brightness, it was order. It was law. When the Book of Enoch speaks of the law of the luminaries, it does not refer to distant stars burning in cold isolation. It speaks of a sacred synchronization. The way light marks seasons, governs tides, and measures the span between birth and death. Uriel, the archangel of illumination, was said to be the keeper of this law. His very name means light of God, and it was he who revealed to Enoch the precise structure of heavenly time. Uriel took him beyond mountains and clouds, beyond the limits of sight, and showed him what no mortal had ever seen: the gates of the sun and moon. 12 portals in the east, 12 in the west, through which the sun traveled each year. Each gate opened at its appointed time, releasing light at a specific angle, dividing the seasons into equal portions. The year was not chaos, it was geometry. In this divine calculus, the number 364 was sacred, the number of days in the true year, according to the ancient priestly calendar. Each quarter held 91 days, divided into 13 perfect weeks. There was no drift, no misalignment. The solstices and equinoxes came like heartbeat and breath. Every feast, every harvest, every Sabbath fell in rhythm with the heavens. Time itself was pure symmetry. And yet the Book of Enoch warns the day would come when this perfect count would be altered, when men would lose the true measure of light. That warning proved prophetic. Somewhere in the corridors of human history, the mathematics of heaven was replaced by the arithmetic of men. But before the fall, the ancients remembered. The Sumerians charted the stars and recorded a year divided into 4 quarters, each tied to the motion of the sun. The Egyptians aligned their temples to solstices, their calendars to the flooding of the Nile. A rhythm as steady as the breath of Ra, their sun god. The early Hebrews, too, counted by solar measure. The Book of Jubilees confirms that their sacred calendar once followed the same divine template. A solar year of 364 days, unbroken, flawless, complete. The priests of early Israel believed that every 7th day and every 7th year echoed heaven's cycle. To keep the wrong count was to break covenant with creation itself. The writer of Jubilees laments a coming corruption, saying, "There will be those who will observe the moon, disturbing the seasons and the years. They will go wrong as to the months and Sabbaths and feasts." The text mourns what science would later confirm: that lunar reckoning drifts, misaligning with the solar year, losing sync with the appointed times. In their eyes, this was not just an error of astronomy, it was a moral and spiritual collapse. When light and time fell out of harmony, so did humanity. The mathematics of light was not meant to confine the world, but to tune it. Ancient priests saw the heavens as a vast instrument, the sun and moon plucking chords of divine energy. Each rotation, each eclipse, each sunrise was part of an ongoing symphony. The angels were its musicians and Uriel was its conductor. His book, Enoch said, was filled with the secrets of the heavens, numbers that spoke of cosmic laws far older than man's civilizations. Modern science, in its own way, has begun to rediscover pieces of this divine language. The speed of light, the constant by which we measure the universe, defines time itself. The number of days in a solar year, the tilt of the Earth's axis, the precession of equinoxes, all trace patterns of astonishing precision. The ancients may not have had telescopes, but they sensed the perfection in creation's design. They knew the cosmos was not random, it was rhythmic. In the Enochian vision, Uriel's revelations were both instruction and warning. "Observe," the angel said, "for the sun moves through its portals according to its order, that it may rise and set in the same measure and not transgress the commandment." But transgression came nonetheless, not from the sun, but from man. Somewhere in the shifting sands of empire, time was rewritten. Babylon rose, and with it came new mathematics, a lunar calendar bound to the phases of the moon rather than the command of the sun. The Babylonians divided the year into 12 months of 29 or 30 days, adjusting with arbitrary additions. It was elegant but flawed, a shadow imitation of heaven's precision. Yet the world followed. By the time of the Second Temple, Jewish priests debated which calendar to keep, the ancient solar reckoning of the patriarchs or the newer lunar system brought from exile. The priests of Jerusalem chose the moon. The sect at Qumran, whom later scholars called the Essenes, chose the sun. Their writings thunder with defiance. "We are the keepers of the appointed times, the sons of light, for the children of darkness have lost the calendar of God." This was no small argument. To them it was the difference between truth and corruption, faith and compromise. Every holy festival, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, depended on the correct calculation of days. To keep them on the wrong schedule was to dishonor heaven itself. The sons of light believed they alone still walked in rhythm with creation while the world danced to false music. Their system was astonishingly detailed. Each season began on a Wednesday, the day, Genesis says, when God created the sun, moon, and stars. The year was divided into 4 equal parts of 91 days, totaling 364. Each quarter ended with a day of transition, a sacred pause marking the turn of the season. Every 52 weeks completed the circle, returning perfectly to the same day. No leap years, no corrections, just harmony. Mathematically, their calendar was more stable than the lunar and even more precise than the early Julian system. But it was not mere precision they sought, it was purity. To them, numbers were holy. 3, 7, 12. The divine architecture of creation. The number 4 marked the seasons, 7 the week, 12 the heavenly gates. Even the sum, 364, symbolized completeness. The cycle of light made flesh in time. Yet as kingdoms rose and fell, this perfection became inconvenient. Empires demanded calendars that served taxation and war, not sacred order. The Romans introduced months of varying lengths, bending time to the politics of power. The Gregorian reform centuries later adjusted it further, prioritizing agricultural economy over celestial truth. Humanity, in its quest for control, severed the last visible link to the mathematics of light. Still, whispers of that ancient knowledge persisted. In Egyptian temples, hieroglyphs recorded solar alignments that matched the Enochian year. In Sumerian tablets, astronomers tracked equinoxes that divided time exactly into 4 parts. In the hidden scrolls of Qumran, scribes wrote of the law of the lights, mourning that the world had forgotten. Even early Christian writers hinted at it. The Book of Revelation speaks of 24 elders around the throne, representing the 24 priestly orders tied to the solar cycle. The imagery was no accident. It was memory. The mathematics of light endured not because men remembered the numbers, but because the cosmos itself refused to forget. Every year, the equinox still arrives on schedule, no matter what calendar hangs on our walls. The stars still return to their places, their timing immaculate. The laws of the luminaries remain unbroken, even as the keepers of time forget who set them in motion. Some scholars believe the 364-day year was never meant to describe the physical orbit of Earth, but the spiritual rhythm beneath it. The ideal year as heaven counts it. In that reckoning, each day corresponds to a degree of divine order, an echo of creation's breath. The missing fraction, the quarter day we now correct with leap years, symbolizes humanity's imperfection, a reminder that we live slightly out of step with the divine beat. What if that missing measure is the reason the world always feels slightly off kilter? Why wars erupt? Why peace never lasts? Why the seasons of faith rise and fall with strange irregularity? The ancients would have said yes. To them, moral chaos and cosmic disorder were the same disease. The cure was not found in conquest or technology, but in returning to the original count, the rhythm of light. Uriel's gift to Enoch was never about prediction. It was about restoration. It was a reminder that the heavens still sing, even if humanity no longer listens. These lights, the angel said, were set for signs and for seasons, and for days and for years, that they might separate light from darkness. The phrase that once marked the first act of Genesis remains a quiet command. Stay in time with the light and creation will remain in tune. The mathematics of light was not superstition. It was faith expressed in precision. It was how the ancients wove worship into astronomy, prayer into observation. They studied the sky not to master it, but to mirror it. To live in sync with heaven was, in their eyes, the highest form of obedience. But as centuries passed, humanity stopped observing and began controlling. We built clocks instead of altars. We measured hours, not seasons. We mastered time but forgot its meaning. We live surrounded by light, yet no longer understand its laws. Still, something in us remembers. The pulse that beats in our veins matches the Earth's magnetic rhythms. Our sleep follows the turning of the sun. Our emotions rise and fall with the moon. Whether we admit it or not, we are still children of the calendar we lost. And perhaps that is why we are drawn to stories like this. Because somewhere deep within we feel that the mathematics of heaven still calls us home. In a world that measures everything, we yearn for the one measure that can't be calculated, the perfect timing of light. The ancients believed that to rediscover that rhythm was to rediscover God's voice. Enoch heard it in the movement of the sun, in the whisper of starlight. We hear it now in the silence between seconds, in the space between breaths. The clock of heaven still turns, flawless, eternal, patient. It waits for the world to remember the music written into its bones. And so, as we step from Enoch's vision into the next chapter of this story, the question lingers. Who changed the clock, and why? Somewhere in history, someone interrupted the song. In the next part, we will follow that fracture, from Babylon's towers to Rome's calendars, and uncover how the loss of one number altered the rhythm of every age. The first wars of history were not fought with swords or chariots, but with calendars. Long before nations argued over borders, they argued over days. To control time was to control worship, labor, and memory itself. Empires learned this early, that the people who set the calendar held the hearts of the people. Because if you can tell a nation when to rest, when to plant, when to mourn, and when to rejoice, you can shape its soul. When Babylon rose to power, it did not merely conquer cities, it conquered the clock. Its kings were mathematicians of the heavens, priests of the moon, and engineers of order. They charted the skies with astonishing precision, building ziggurats as observatories to watch the gods move across the night. For the Babylonians, time was cyclical, but it was ruled by the moon, whose waxing and waning mirrored the fate of kings. Months began not with dawn but with darkness, the moment when the first sliver of silver light reappeared in the sky. It was a beautiful system, but one that drifted. Lunar years lost their place against the seasons, and the priests of Babylon compensated with adjustments, adding days or even months to keep their festivals aligned with harvest and flood. But the deeper purpose was political. Only the priesthood knew when the true month began. Only they could declare the new year. Time became a temple secret administered from the top down. The calendar was power. When Judah fell and her people were led into Babylonian exile, they entered a world governed by this lunar order. They carried with them fragments of their old ways. The solar calendar of Enoch, the rhythm of the Sabbaths, the feasts set by the movement of the sun. To the exiles, these were not mere customs. They were the last remnants of divine order. But now they faced a question that would divide them for centuries. Whose clock would they follow? The one written by angels or the one decreed by empire? The book of Daniel captures this struggle in symbols. Nebuchadnezzar's image of gold and bronze and clay was not just a prophecy of kingdoms, it was a mirror of shifting times. Daniel's people measured life by the appointed feasts, Passover, weeks, tabernacles, each tied to solar calculation. But Babylon demanded allegiance to its lunar cycles and its gods of night. The confrontation was cosmic. Sun versus moon, heaven versus empire. The Sabbath itself hung in the balance. In the courts of exile, the priests debated. Should the Sabbath follow the phases of the moon as Babylon did, letting it drift across the year? Or should it remain fixed, every seventh day, eternal and unmoving, a mirror of heaven's perfect rhythm? To Babylon, this was trivial. To Israel, it was everything. For the Sabbath was not just rest, it was rebellion. To keep it according to heaven's calendar was to say, "You do not own my time. My time belongs to God." The prophet Ezekiel, writing among the exiles, speaks with anguish of times and seasons profaned. His visions are filled with wheels within wheels, the mathematics of heaven turning against the machinery of empire. Time had become a battlefield. When the exiles finally returned to Jerusalem under Persian rule, they brought back two visions of time. One they had inherited from Enoch, and one they had learned from their captors. In the rebuilding of the temple, those visions collided. The priests of the Second Temple argued not only about law and ritual, but about the calendar itself. Behind every festival, every sacrifice, lay a question deeper than theology. Who owns time? The debates grew fierce. Some insisted that the new moons must dictate the months. Others argued that the sun, not the moon, was the true clock of creation. The Book of Jubilees, likely written by those who still clung to Enoch's reckoning, warned that if Israel adopted the lunar system, the feasts would fall out of their season, and they will walk in darkness. To them, lunar reckoning was not just error, it was apostasy. It meant surrendering the calendar of heaven to the mathematics of men. This was not mere superstition. The priestly class understood that whoever controlled the sacred days controlled the people's relationship to the divine. The calendar determined when sacrifices were offered, when debts were forgiven, when slaves were released, when the trumpet of Jubilee was sounded. Change the count, and you change the covenant. Over time, the lunar priests won. The world turned away from the solar calendar of Enoch and embraced the moon's cycles. The old system faded from the temple scrolls, surviving only in secret among groups who refused to conform. Among them were the Essenes, a community that would later retreat into the desert at Qumran. There they wrote of themselves as the Sons of Light, a title not poetic but literal. They saw themselves as keepers of the solar law, preserving the true time against the corruption of empire. Their writings echo with defiance. "We are the men of the covenant," they declared, "who walk in the exact reckoning of the times." To them, the temple in Jerusalem had fallen under darkness because its priests had followed the wrong calendar. Every misaligned feast, every misplaced Sabbath was a sin against creation itself. For in their belief, heaven still ran on solar measure. The angels kept count. The gates of the sun opened and closed in perfect sequence. The temple should have followed. The Essenes refused to yield. They kept their year of 364 days, divided into 4 equal quarters of 13 weeks. Each season began on the 4th day, the day of light's creation. They marked equinox and solstice with prayers that mirrored the Book of Enoch's law of the luminaries. Every ritual, every fast, every sunrise prayer was synchronized to the movements of the heavens. Time was not their servant, it was their offering. Meanwhile, in the wider world, time was being redefined again. The Persian Empire introduced refinements to the Babylonian system, formalizing the 12-month lunar year with intercalary months added by royal decree. This method spread across the ancient world and became the foundation of calendars from Greece to Rome. Lunar priests became astronomers. Empires began to treat the calendar as a tool of administration, taxation, and control. The sacred rhythm of heaven was buried beneath bureaucracy, and yet the resistance never vanished. Even in exile, even under occupation, the memory of the original count endured. The Psalms speak of the sun as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, rejoicing to run his course. The Book of Enoch's influence can be traced in the priestly writings of the Second Temple period, where solar symbolism dominates. The menorah representing the lights of heaven, the priestly garments woven with gold thread to reflect divine radiance. The War of Calendars was more than theological debate. It was an unseen struggle for the soul of civilization. Time had always been the language of faith. The creation story itself was structured in sevens, the divine rhythm of work and rest echoing through every week. To alter that count was to alter the heartbeat of the cosmos. And so each new empire carried its own calendar as a banner of dominion. Egypt had its solar year tied to the Nile. Babylon followed the moon. Greece introduced its Olympiads, measuring time by the cycles of games. Rome would soon remake it altogether, renaming months after its rulers. When Alexander's armies marched east, they brought the Hellenic calendar, blending lunar and solar reckoning. Under his successors, Judea once again faced pressure to conform. To observe one's own calendar became a quiet act of rebellion. In the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, when he desecrated the temple and outlawed Hebrew customs, the Book of Maccabees records that faithful priests still kept their feasts in secret, counting days by the hidden measure of the sun. Even in persecution, they refused to let empire own their time. This conflict between solar and lunar reckoning seeped into everything: prophecy, politics, even perception. The prophets measured their visions in weeks, months, and jubilees, drawing meaning from patterns in time. When the wrong calendar prevailed, so did confusion. Dates of sacred events no longer aligned. Prophecies appeared delayed or distorted. Heaven's clock ticked on, but humanity had lost the ability to read it. Some rabbis in later centuries would try to reconcile the two, creating hybrid calendars that blended solar and lunar cycles. They believed peace could be found in compromise. But to the keepers of the ancient solar law, this was blasphemy. You could not mix light and darkness, they said. You could not marry the rhythm of heaven with the mathematics of empire. The war of calendars was never settled. Each generation inherited its consequences. When Julius Caesar came to power, he sought to fix the chaos of Roman time. Months that no longer matched the seasons, harvests falling out of rhythm. His reform, guided by Egyptian astronomers, produced the Julian calendar, a solar system of 12 months and 365 days, adding a leap year every fourth to correct drift. It was efficient, but it was human. Heaven's symmetry was gone. The old priests would have looked upon it with sorrow. To them, even a single day added beyond the count of 364 was rebellion, a human fingerprint on divine design. But Caesar's system conquered the world. Later, Pope Gregory would refine it further, creating the calendar we still use today. Few remember that, beneath its months lies the ghost of the ancient war. Yet the echoes remain. Our weeks of 7 days, our festivals aligned to solstice and equinox, our very measurement of years, all trace back to that forgotten conflict between the calendar of angels and the calendar of kings. The question that haunted the exiles of Babylon still lingers. Who owns time? If we look closer, we see that the battle was never only about astronomy. It was about allegiance, about whether humanity would keep time with heaven or with empire. To follow the lunar calendar was to submit to earthly rulers who declared when the month began. To follow the solar calendar was to trust in a higher order, one that no king could alter. In the end, perhaps that is why the ancient writers spoke of light and darkness not just as metaphors, but as measures. Light moves in straight paths, constant, predictable, eternal. The moon waxes and wanes, changing shape, shifting shadows. One represents the constancy of the divine, the other the restlessness of man. The world chose the moon, and with it came the drift, a slow dissonance between heaven's order and earth's rhythm. But those who remembered, the keepers of the old ways, the watchers of the equinox, the scribes who still read Enoch's book, believed that one day the clocks would reconcile. When that day comes, they said, heaven and earth will once again beat in the same tempo. The Sabbath will find its true hour. The calendar of angels will rise again. And perhaps, in some quiet way, it already has. For every time we pause at sunrise, every time we mark a season not by date but by light, we participate in that ancient defiance. The faith that time itself still belongs to the one who made it. When the dust of empire had long settled and the voices of prophets seemed swallowed by time, the desert still remembered. Beneath the cliffs of the Dead Sea and the stillness of Qumran, scrolls lay sealed within clay jars, hidden by hands that believed they would one day be found. Centuries turned to millennia. Empires rose, fell, and crumbled into silence. The winds shifted, but the scrolls waited, resting in the cool dark like seeds preserved for a distant spring. When they were finally unsealed in the 20th century, the world expected fragments of scripture, perhaps forgotten psalms or temple laws. What scholars found instead was something far more profound, a record of time itself. Among the brittle parchment and shattered jars were fragments that spoke of a lost calendar, a solar reckoning so precise, so consistent that it defied the drift of ages. The writers called themselves the Sons of Light. To them, this was not invention, but preservation. They claimed their system was not from Babylon, Greece, or Rome, but from angels. They said it was the true rhythm of creation. The same divine order revealed to Enoch by Uriel, the archangel of light. Every season, they wrote, began on the same day, the 4th day of the week, the day the sun was created. From that fixed point, the year turned like a perfect wheel of fire. It was not superstition, but mathematics woven with faith. Their year contained 364 days, 4 equal quarters of 91, each composed of 13 weeks. Every season ended in a sacred day of transition before the next began. There was no need for correction, no drifting feast, no confusion of months. The cycle of the sun itself kept the count. The priests who followed it called this the calendar of heaven, and for them keeping it was not a choice. It was obedience. The discovery at Qumran shocked the modern world because it challenged what many had assumed about ancient religion. Most scholars had believed that the Israelites, like their neighbors, followed a lunar calendar, that their months rose and fell with the moon's phases. But here was evidence that another system had existed, one older, one purer, rooted not in the changing night, but in the unwavering sun. This was not the calendar of empire. This was the calendar of angels. The scroll spoke of divisions and disputes, of priests exiled from the temple in Jerusalem for refusing to abandon the old reckoning. They accused the temple leaders of corruption, of aligning their worship to the lunar months of foreign powers. To the sons of light, this was not just an administrative error, it was betrayal. The moment Israel began to count time according to the moon rather than the sun, they believed it had fallen out of harmony with heaven. Their withdrawal into the desert was not isolation, it was protest. They had come to restore the rhythm of creation. To understand their conviction, one must see how deeply they linked time to holiness. To them, every act of worship, every offering, every fast, every festival, was sacred only if performed at the appointed time. The wrong day meant the wrong alignment. The wrong alignment meant disobedience, and disobedience disrupted the entire order of creation. In their writings, one can hear the urgency, almost desperation, for they have forsaken the paths of light, and their times have been turned into darkness. They were not trying to start a new religion. They were trying to keep the world in tune. Every week, every season, every year in their calendar mirrored the structure of heaven itself. 7 days formed a week, a reflection of the sevenfold creation. 4 seasons marked the 4 quarters of the world, north, south, east, and west, corresponding to the 4 living creatures around the throne in Ezekiel's vision. 24 priestly courses served in rotation throughout the year, echoing the 24 heavenly elders in the book of Revelation. The sun, moon, and stars were not symbols. They were instruments in a divine symphony. The sons of light saw themselves as the earthly choir keeping time with heaven's orchestra. Their texts describe the changing of the seasons with a precision that modern astronomers still marvel at. They calculated the equinoxes, the solstices, the exact days when light and darkness balanced or diverged. But what mattered most to them was not observation but revelation. They believed that these calculations had been given, not discovered, entrusted to humanity through Enoch, the first to ascend and read the celestial tablets. Every time they wrote down a date, they believed they were reinscribing the same law once engraved by angels. The caves of Qumran preserved dozens of copies of these calendars, alongside writings on priestly duties, purification rituals, and prophecies. Together they formed the backbone of a theology that revolved around time itself. The community saw history as a cosmic countdown, a battle between light and darkness unfolding according to predetermined seasons. They believed that when the appointed cycle ended, God would restore the world to its original order. The true calendar was not just a record of days, it was a prophecy of destiny. What makes their conviction extraordinary is how much they resisted the world's pressure to conform. By the time of their writings, Rome ruled Judea. Roman calendars, lunar months, and imperial festivals dominated public life. Yet the sons of light refused to bow to those measures. They rejected the authority of the temple priests who had compromised with empire. They lived by their own time, counted their own feasts, and saw themselves as citizens of a different kingdom. In their language, Rome was the dominion of darkness, and its calendar a counterfeit. For 2,000 years their scrolls remained hidden, a buried protest against the corruption of sacred time. When archaeologists first unrolled those fragile fragments, they were astonished by the precision of the texts. One fragment listed the names of priestly families assigned to each week of the year, rotating in cycles that perfectly matched the divisions of the solar calendar. Another detailed how the festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, fell on the same weekdays every year, never shifting as they do in the lunar calendar. It was a system of breathtaking order, as though written to reflect the unchanging nature of the Creator himself. And yet, the most haunting discovery was not the mathematics but the tone. The scrolls were filled with longing, for restoration, for the return of divine order. The writers believed they were living in an age of corruption, waiting for the visitation of light. They looked forward to a time when the true reckoning would be restored, when the heavenly calendar would once again rule the earth. In their view, that event would mark the arrival of the Messiah, not merely a savior of souls, but the restorer of time. In their theology, sin was not simply moral failure, it was temporal disorder. To live out of sync with God's rhythm was to live in rebellion against his design. The Sabbath, the togs, feasts, the jubilees, all were part of a sacred choreography meant to keep creation aligned. When humanity changed the count, the dance faltered, history became dissonant. This belief echoes faintly through later scriptures. The New Testament's language of fullness of time and appointed seasons mirrors the same worldview. The Apostle Paul wrote that in the fullness of time the Messiah came, an idea that would have resonated deeply with those who still remembered Enoch's and Qumran's calendar. To them, even redemption unfolded according to heavenly arithmetic. Modern readers often approach these discoveries as curiosities of archaeology, ancient data points in the history of religion. But to the people who wrote them, they were matters of life and death. The Sons of Light believed they were preserving the covenant itself, that if they lost the true calendar, they would lose their connection to God. Time was their temple. Counting it correctly was worship. Even their daily life reflected this conviction. They rose at dawn to recite prayers of light, aligning themselves with the first rays of the sun. They marked the 4th, 8th, and 12th hours with psalms of praise. At twilight, as the sun slipped beyond the horizon, they gave thanks for the balance of day and night, a living reflection of the order they guarded. To them, every hour had purpose. Every movement of the heavens carried meaning. What they guarded unknowingly was one of the most sophisticated systems of timekeeping in antiquity. Their calendar required no correction for centuries. It predicted equinoxes with remarkable accuracy, yet they never credited themselves for its precision. They called it a gift, a law revealed, not invented. That humility, that refusal to claim ownership may be what preserved it so faithfully. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and scattered its people, the desert once again became a refuge for memory. The scrolls sealed away became the last witnesses of a world that refused to let time be ruled by men. And so they slept, through empire, through conquest, through silence, until the 20th century, when a Bedouin shepherd stumbled upon a jar in a cave. The fragments he found would rewrite the story of the Bible's transmission and restore a missing piece of human history. What those fragments revealed was not just another ancient sect, but an unbroken echo of the first command of Genesis. Let there be lights in the heavens for signs and for seasons and for days and years. The Sons of Light had taken that command literally. While the world counted months by the moon, they counted days by the sun, the same light that God declared good on the 4th day. And so the calendar of heaven had never truly vanished. It had only been buried, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. When it did, it reminded the modern world of something it had forgotten. That time was once sacred, and that, The keeping of it was an act of faith. In their quiet devotion, the sons of light believed they were standing guard over more than numbers. They were keeping the pulse of creation. Every sunrise was a covenant renewed. Every season a verse in a song too vast for any one generation to hear in full. They believed that as long as they kept count, the melody would never die. Perhaps that is why, 2,000 years later, their scrolls resurfaced, as if the earth itself refused to keep their silence any longer. The calendar of heaven, hidden in the dust, had waited for humanity to remember what it once knew. That time is not a chain but a circle, not a tool but a trust, and that somewhere beyond our calendars and clocks, the keeper of the seasons still counts the days with unbroken light. When the ancients spoke of angels, they did not picture delicate wings or painted halos. They imagined beings of power, luminous intelligences woven from light and purpose. Each had a role, a function, a note in the cosmic harmony. Among them stood Uriel, the archangel of light and wisdom, keeper of the sacred mathematics, guardian of the heavenly vault. While Michael led the hosts in battle and Gabriel carried divine messages, Uriel watched the stars. He was not a warrior. He was a keeper of knowledge, the custodian of time itself. In the Enochic vision, Uriel is the angel who escorts the prophet through the secret architecture of creation. He does not show him visions of war or judgment, but of rhythm, of the hidden order that sustains all existence. He reveals how the portals of the heavens govern the movements of the luminaries. 12 gates in the east, 12 in the west. Through these, the sun journeys each year, marking the appointed times. To Enoch, it must have felt as though he were being shown the beating heart of the universe. Each gate, Uriel explained, corresponds to a specific season. The sun passes through the first gate at the spring equinox, rising precisely in the east, dividing day and night equally. Then it moves northward through the gates until midsummer, when light dominates the day. From there it descends again, returning to balance at the autumn equinox and sinking to its lowest gate at midwinter. The pattern repeats. 6 ascending, 6 descending, a perfect loop of balance and return. It was through these gates that creation itself breathed. Uriel's revelation to Enoch was not astronomy as we know it. It was theology written in motion. The gates were not mere coordinates. They were living thresholds, guarded by angels who opened and closed them in obedience to divine command. Time in this vision was alive, a pulse that moved through invisible hands. Every dawn was a renewal of covenant. Every equinox was the turning of a heavenly key. But Enoch was not just shown the gates of the sun, he was taught the paths of the moon, the stars, and the winds. He saw how light and darkness measured the years, how one path lengthened while another shortened, and how the cycle of days completed itself in perfect intervals of 364. Uriel called this the law of the luminaries, the divine order written into the heavens before humanity drew its first breath. To violate it, he warned, was to disturb the harmony of creation. These visions were not symbolic to Enoch. They were literal. In his writings, we read his astonishment. I saw the courses of the luminaries of the heaven, and how they do not turn from their paths. To him, the stars were not cold spheres of gas. They were obedient servants of the Most High, each performing its appointed duty. He wrote that even the stars have names and rulers and times, and that they sing as they move. Modern readers might dismiss this as myth, but for Enoch and those who followed his teachings, it was revelation, a glimpse into the structure of reality itself. Uriel's role in all this cannot be overstated. In Hebrew and early Christian thought, he is the embodiment of divine intelligence, the light that illuminates understanding. His very presence signifies clarity, insight, and the ordering of chaos. In later Jewish mysticism, he becomes associated with the element of fire, not destructive flame, but the fire of perception that reveals truth. To study the heavens, in Uriel's view, was to study God's handwriting across the sky. For Enoch, the encounter with Uriel changed everything. He was no longer a man watching the sun rise. He was a witness to eternity in motion. The angel told him that time is not a river but a circle, an endless turning where beginnings and endings are the same point seen from different angles. As it was, so it shall be again, Uriel said, a phrase that echoes through apocalyptic writings even into Revelation. The ancients understood this not as fatalism, but as faith in divine constancy. The world may change, empires may fall, but the gates of heaven open and close in the same rhythm they have since the first light was spoken into existence. The Book of Enoch describes Uriel leading the prophet across fiery corridors of sky, showing him the chambers of the sun and moon. There Enoch sees the angelic scribes who record the exact measure of each day, ensuring that no star strays from its path. He learns that these heavenly beings are the keepers of seasons, the unseen reason why the rains come when they do, why harvest follows seed time, why dawn always returns. The entire machinery of the cosmos, from comet to raindrop, was bound to angelic obedience. It is said that Uriel also showed Enoch the consequences of disobedience, what happens when the watchers rebel, when divine order is broken. The fallen angels, those who took human wives and corrupted creation, were once also keepers of knowledge. They taught forbidden arts to mankind, metallurgy, enchantments, vanity, twisting divine wisdom into tools of pride. But what they could not imitate, it was Uriel's light. His knowledge served not mastery, but harmony. Where they sought control, he preserved balance. That distinction still haunts the world. Humanity has learned to measure the stars, to map the heavens, to predict eclipses with flawless precision. Yet it has forgotten why those lights were set in motion in the first place. Uriel's revelation was not about control. It was about reverence. The angels were not clockmakers, they were caretakers of rhythm, ensuring that creation sang its appointed song. In the Qumran writings, echoes of this teaching resurface. The sons of light spoke of angelic governors of times who oversaw the seasons, ensuring that the year kept its sacred symmetry. They believed Uriel's knowledge had been entrusted to their priesthood, that they alone, by keeping the solar calendar, were participating in the same divine order. To them, each season was overseen by an angelic prince, and the transitions between them, the equinoxes and solstices, were sacred gates of renewal. Every ritual they performed was designed to mirror what Uriel had shown Enoch. The lighting of lamps, the rotation of priests, the reading of psalms at specific hours, all corresponded to heavenly movements. They saw themselves as earthly partners in a cosmic partnership. When they prayed, they believed their voices joined the angelic choirs who sang as the sun passed through its gates. It is striking that Uriel's name appears again in later apocalyptic texts, including some early Christian writings. In certain versions of the Apocalypse of Peter and the writings of Ezra, Uriel is portrayed as the angel who interprets visions of the end, explaining the meaning of ages, jubilees, and appointed times. His role never changes. He remains the one who makes sense of divine timing. Even in Revelation, though unnamed, his influence lingers in the 24 elders, the cycles of sevens, the precise measurements of heavenly architecture. Wherever time is described as sacred order, Uriel's shadow stands nearby. To many theologians, Uriel represents the bridge between heaven's perfection and earth's confusion. He is the memory of what time was meant to be, unbroken, luminous, measured in light rather than in decay. When humanity measures time by its own inventions, clocks, calendars, deadlines, it participates in a kind of spiritual amnesia. But when it looks up, when it marks the equinox, when it aligns itself to the rhythm of the stars, it touches that lost memory again. In every age there have been those who tried to recover it. Astronomer priests in Egypt aligned pyramids with solstices. Babylonian magi tracked the stars. Medieval monks built cathedrals whose windows caught the sunrise at precise equinox angles. Whether they knew it or not, they were following the path Uriel had traced for Enoch. The sacred and the scientific were never enemies in that vision. They were one and the same, both seeking the order that underlies creation. But Enoch's encounter with Uriel was more than a revelation of numbers. It was a revelation of intimacy. The angel told him that God's light was not confined to heaven. It flowed through everything that lived. The light of the sun, he said, is the reflection of his mercy. The light of the moon, the reflection of his justice. Every ray, every shadow carried meaning. The mathematics of heaven was moral as much as mechanical. Uriel's light revealed not only how time works, but why it matters. To live in the right season, to act, speak, and rest according to divine timing, was to live in harmony with creation. That was the heart of wisdom. And wisdom, he told Enoch, was not stored in scrolls or temples, but in alignment. When one's life moved in rhythm with the heavens, knowledge unfolded naturally. Yet humanity forgot. Wars, kingdoms, and empires built their own clocks, measuring not the turning of the sun, but the rise and fall of power. The gates of heaven still opened and closed, but no one listened for their sound. The world that once danced to a celestial rhythm now stumbled through artificial time. And still the angels kept count. In a way, the rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was not just an archaeological triumph. It was the faint echo of those turning keys, the sound of Uriel's light flickering through history once more. For in those texts lay the memory of his revelation. That time was alive, breathing through angels, calibrated by light. Perhaps Uriel's lesson was never meant to be lost, only buried until humanity was ready to understand it anew, not through superstition, but through awe. Today, as we map galaxies and calculate the age of stars, we are again standing where Enoch once stood, looking up, wondering if the motion we see is random or purposeful. The mathematics says it is flawless. The faith says it is intentional. Uriel would say it is both, because in heaven's language, precision is worship. Somewhere beyond all our hours and calendars, the 12 gates still open and close. The sun still journeys through them, marking the appointed times. The angels still turn their keys. And though humanity may have forgotten the sound, the rhythm has never ceased. For time, as Uriel revealed, is not the ticking of a clock. It is the breathing of God. And every sunrise is his whisper, reminding creation that the music of light still plays, waiting for those who remember how to listen. When Uriel's light faded from Enoch's sight, what lingered was not only the vision of celestial gates, but the rhythm they represented. The pulse of divine mercy that measured not merely days and seasons, but the rise and fall of human ages. That rhythm would echo in the next great revelation, a covenant written not in stars but in time itself. It was called the Jubilee, the crown of sevens, the restoration hidden within the cycles of creation. The Book of Jubilees, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, was no ordinary text. It was a mirror of Genesis and Exodus, retelling the origins of the world through the language of time. Every story, every command, every covenant was mapped according to sacred intervals. History, the author claimed, did not unfold randomly. It moved according to God's clock, 7 days, 7 years, 7 sevens. Each completion marked renewal, forgiveness, and freedom. To understand the Jubilee was to understand divine time itself. In that rhythm, every seventh day was a Sabbath, a pause for creation to breathe. Every seventh year was a Sabbath for the land, the soil's rest mirroring the soul's. And after 7 cycles of 7 years, 49 in total, came the Jubilee, the 50th year, the great reset of the world. Debts were forgiven, slaves were released, fields returned to their rightful families. It was not charity, it was restoration. A world that had drifted toward greed and imbalance was called back into alignment with heaven's fairness. To the ancients, this was not only economics or ethics, it was cosmology. They believed the universe itself followed this rhythm. 6 cycles of creation, then rest. 6,000 years of history, then redemption. Time was a living organism inhaling and exhaling, every breath measured by divine mercy. The Jubilee was not just an event, it was a heartbeat. In the writings of the Essenes, echoes of this law reverberate with reverence. They saw the Jubilee as proof that time was moral, that it carried consequences for disobedience. When men stopped honoring the sevens, they said, the land itself grew weary. Crops failed, kingdoms fell, and chaos crept back into the rhythm of the world. The priests of Qumran believed the calendar of heaven was the cure, the solar order of 364 days, divided into perfect quarters, each echoing the creative pattern of 7 sevens. To break that rhythm was to break harmony with creation. The Book of Jubilees claimed that the angels themselves kept count of these cycles. Each Jubilee was recorded in heavenly tablets, the divine ledger of history. Enoch had glimpsed them in his vision, and Moses, according to the text, was later shown the same tablets on Sinai. What humanity called years, heaven called breaths. Every Jubilee was a sigh of release, a divine exhalation after the long labor of 7 times 7. But by the time of Rome, that sacred breath had been stifled. The rhythm of mercy gave way to the march of empire. The Sabbath became a legal formality, the Jubilee a forgotten myth. The temple priests, entangled with politics, no longer proclaimed release. Fields stayed in the hands of the powerful, debts accumulated, and slaves remained in chains. The law of rest was replaced by the economics of endless labor. Rome's calendar, like its armies, was relentless. Time was no longer sacred, it was taxable. The Julian reform had standardized the year into 12 months for the sake of imperial administration. The heavens might still turn according to divine rhythm, but the empire turned according to its own. In this new order, there was no place for interruption, no pause for grace. The world's time had become unbroken, and therefore unhealed. The few who remembered the old ways retreated once more into the wilderness. Among them were the descendants of the priestly families who had fled Jerusalem's corruption. They carried scrolls that spoke of the Sabbath of years, the Jubilee of Jubilees, the 70 weeks decreed for the purification of the world. These were not abstract ideas to them, they were prophecies. They believed that history itself was counting down to a final Jubilee, the great restoration when heaven and earth would realign. In their writings, one finds a haunting lament. The sons of darkness have turned aside the appointed times and corrupted the years. But the sons of light keep the count of the weeks as it was revealed. For them, keeping the count was a form of worship, a declaration that empires might control armies but not the clock of God. The Jubilee was the purest expression of heaven's mathematics of mercy. Every 49 years, everything reset. Ownership dissolved. Hierarchy collapsed. Those who had fallen into poverty were restored. Land returned to those who had lost it. It was divine justice encoded into time itself. Not through rebellion, but through rhythm. The idea was staggering, that equality, forgiveness, and freedom were not optional virtues but the very structure of the universe. This cycle was not unique to Israel. Other ancient cultures preserved shadows of it, echoes of a primordial order. The Babylonians held occasional debt forgiveness years. The Egyptians celebrated the renewal of kingship in rituals tied to the rising of Sirius. But the Hebrew Jubilee was different. It was not bound to political will or celestial events alone. It was covenantal, a command woven into creation. When the prophets later condemned Israel for its injustices, they often did so in the language of violated Sabbaths. Jeremiah warned that because the land had been denied its rest, it would rest by force, through desolation. The exile itself was described as 70 Sabbaths missed, 70 cycles of neglect repaid in silence. The people had broken the rhythm, and so the rhythm broke them. Yet even in judgment there was a whisper of restoration. Isaiah prophesied of a servant who would proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, a phrase that unmistakably referred to the Jubilee. In later generations, this prophecy would be read as messianic, pointing toward the one who would come not only to forgive sin but to reset creation's clock. The Messiah, they believed, would bring about the final Jubilee, the eternal release. The Essenes believed they were living in the generation of that countdown. Their writings divide history into jubilees, marking the rise and fall of nations according to sacred sevens. To them, the appearance of corruption in the temple and the tyranny of Rome were signs that the world had reached the end of a cycle, the threshold of renewal. They called themselves the remnant of the covenant, the keepers of the true calendar, waiting for the trumpet of release. In their communities, the Jubilee was not just awaited, it was rehearsed. They practiced communal ownership of property, shared food and resources, and forgave debts among themselves. In this way, they lived as if the final Jubilee had already begun. For them, faith was not anticipation but participation. They were living inside the prophecy. But history, as always, was unkind to those who lived against empire's rhythm. The Romans regarded their discipline as fanaticism, their separatism as rebellion. When war erupted in Judea, the desert communities were caught in the crossfire. The sons of light were scattered, their scrolls sealed away. The law of mercy vanished beneath layers of ash and salt. What remained was silence, the pause between cycles. And yet silence does not mean absence. When the scrolls were found nearly 2,000 years later, the Book of Jubilees was among them, its pages brittle but its message intact. It spoke not only of past cycles but of the great pattern yet to come. Its author insisted that history moves like breath: creation, fall, redemption, rest. The same fourfold rhythm that Uriel had revealed to Enoch now reappeared in the language of covenant. The Jubilee was the pulse of the divine heart, beating through the centuries, waiting to be heard again. Even in later theology, the echo remained. Early Christian writers saw the life of Christ as the fulfillment of the Jubilee. When he proclaimed good news to the poor and release to the captives, they heard Isaiah's prophecy reborn. In one passage of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus reads that ancient verse and declares, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." To those who understood the old calendar, those words were seismic. He was not simply announcing spiritual salvation. He was declaring a cosmic reset, a return to the calendar of heaven. But as centuries passed, even that understanding dimmed. The Church inherited Rome's calendar and built its liturgical year upon imperial time. The concept of Jubilee was spiritualized, turned inward, removed from fields and debts and seasons. It became a metaphor rather than a mandate. The rhythm of release was forgotten, and yet the world still longs for it. Every revolution, every cry for justice, every yearning for equality is, at its root, a plea for jubilee. The ancient memory that time itself was once merciful. We sense even now that history should move toward restoration, not ruin. The very idea of progress, of cycles of renewal, is a secular echo of that sacred promise. The priests who once kept the angelic count could not have imagined how long their silence would last. Their scrolls lay buried beneath sand and salt, their calendar lost to empire's memory. But perhaps their faith was not in vain. For even if humanity forgot, heaven did not. The gates of time still turn according to that old rhythm. Somewhere beyond our noise and neglect, the divine mathematics continues. 7 upon 7, release upon release, the slow heartbeat of a merciful creator still keeping count. Maybe that is why when we look back across the ruins of history, we sometimes feel as though something vast and unseen still breathes through it all. The rise and fall of nations, the collapse of systems, the return of hope after despair. These are not random tides. They are echoes of a pattern too ancient to erase. The Jubilee was never truly lost. It was only buried, like the scrolls themselves, waiting for the appointed time to rise again. And when it does, when the world finally remembers how to rest, how to forgive, how to release, perhaps then the calendar of heaven will once again match the rhythm of the earth. The sands of empire always seem to bury the sacred, the rhythm that once bound heaven and earth. That angelic count kept by Enoch, guarded by Uriel, preserved by the sons of light, was not lost in an instant. It was eroded, one decree at a time. Each empire added its own numbers, its own names, its own gods to the measure of the year. What had begun as the music of light became the machinery of power. Time, which had once been a covenant, was transformed into a commodity. The world did not forget heaven's calendar through ignorance, but through ambition. For those who sought dominion over nations soon realized that to control time was to control life itself. The days, once dictated by sunrise and sacred cycles, became tools of taxation, harvest, and rule. The angels had set the dial, humanity rewired it. The story begins in Rome, where a general named Julius Caesar decided that even the heavens needed reform. By his age, the old Roman calendar had fallen into chaos. Months drifted, festivals arrived in the wrong seasons, and the equinox itself seemed to wander. But the disorder was not accidental. It was convenient. Priests who controlled the calendar could shift the timing of elections or extend the reign of favored officials simply by adding or omitting days. Time had become political. Caesar's solution was to standardize it. In 46 before Christ, guided by Egyptian astronomers, he introduced the Julian calendar, a new order that aligned months to imperial will rather than to creation's balance. It fixed the year at 365 days, adding an extra day every fourth year to correct drift. It was efficient, mathematical, and entirely human. The sacred symmetry of 364 was broken. To the modern world, this change seems trivial, a matter of administration. But to those who remembered the ancient pattern, it was cosmic rebellion. The Enochian calendar was founded on the number 7, the divine ratio of creation. The Julian system was built upon fractions, the mathematics of compromise. The Sabbath was no longer the heartbeat of the week. It became an echo lost in a tide of Roman months named after emperors. July for Julius, August for Augustus. The very sky was rewritten to flatter men. The priests who once kept the count would have seen this as an act of desecration. The new year no longer began in the season of creation, but in the middle of winter, a triumph of empire over nature. The festivals of light and harvest that once aligned with equinox and solstice were displaced. In place of angelic order came bureaucratic convenience. The rhythm of heaven was silenced beneath the march of legions. Still, the old knowledge persisted. For centuries, Jewish scholars and desert mystics whispered of the true year. The 364-day cycle that measured not human ambition but divine intention. They said the world had fallen out of sync with its own heartbeat. Seasons no longer spoke the same language as the stars. Crops, climate, even conscience drifted. Humanity lived by artificial time, a clock ticking in defiance of heaven's pulse. When the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, the calendar's authority deepened. The Church inherited not the heavenly reckoning of Enoch, but the imperial schedule of Caesar. Sundays replaced Sabbaths, months and feasts were redefined to suit ecclesiastical order. Time itself was baptized into empire, yet beneath the hymns and rituals a quiet dissonance grew. The faithful celebrated Easter according to lunar calculations inherited from Babylon, while the solar equinox that once marked divine renewal was forgotten. The very day that symbolized resurrection was divorced from the light it once followed. By the Middle Ages, this dissonance had deepened into confusion. The Julian calendar, though meant to be permanent, proved imperfect. It gained nearly 11 minutes every year, an error small enough to go unnoticed for centuries but vast enough to shift the seasons over time. By the 16th century, the spring equinox, once on March 21st, was falling in early March. The Church's holiest feasts no longer matched the heavens. The rhythm of worship was adrift. Enter Pope Gregory XIII. In 1582, he issued a new decree to correct the drift. 10 days were erased from history. Thursday, October 4th was followed by Friday, October 15th. A simple stroke of pen and papal seal severed the last thin thread that connected humanity's time to Genesis. The Gregorian calendar, as it would be called, was practical and precise. But to those who remembered the old ways and to those who still heard whispers of the angelic count, it was the final betrayal. For them, this was not reform. It was rebellion. The number of the year no longer reflected creation's pattern. The week, the month, the season, all had been restructured to serve men rather than heaven. What had been divine rhythm became mechanical measurement. Time was no longer a song, it was a system. The irony was profound. In trying to perfect time, humanity had imprisoned it. The Gregorian reform achieved astonishing accuracy, but at the cost of meaning. The earth still turned, the sun still passed through its 12 gates, but no one marked its journey. The calendar on the wall no longer sang in harmony with the sky. The ancients would have seen this as spiritual dissonance, the moment when the heart stops beating in rhythm with its own pulse. The prophets had warned that when sacred time was forgotten, disorder would follow. The earth mourns and fades away, wrote Isaiah, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. To them, time itself was part of that covenant. To change it was to cut the cord that tethered creation to its source. In the centuries that followed, that dissonance spread. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the corruption. Clocks replaced seasons. The day was carved into hours, the hour into minutes, the minute into seconds. Midnight, once the still point between darkness and dawn, became merely another measure. Factories dictated rhythm now, not the rising sun. The natural order, once set to cycles of light, became enslaved to machines. Humanity, in mastering time, lost its peace, and yet something in us still remembers the lost music. Farmers feel it in the soil when planting begins too soon or too late. Astronomers sense it when calculating celestial drift. Even our bodies rebel. Our circadian rhythms fight against the glowing screens that tell us it is day when it is night. The heart still hears what the mind has forgotten. That time was meant to breathe, not tick. In the writings of early theologians, one finds a haunting idea that sin itself is a distortion of time. Augustine described the fall as the moment when humanity stepped out of the eternal present into the anxiety of past and future. In that sense, the corruption of the calendar is not just historical, it is existential. We live divided, always chasing what has been or fearing what will be, never aligned with the eternal now. The calendar of heaven was the cure for that fracture. It taught humanity to live in rhythm, to work, rest, and renew according to divine measure. But the modern world moves faster than any season. Its calendar no longer measures harmony but productivity. Days are bought, sold, and scheduled. The Sabbath has become leisure, the Jubilee a metaphor. The sacred intervals that once governed justice, ecology, and soul have been replaced by efficiency. And beneath the noise of progress, there is a strange fatigue, the weariness of a species that no longer knows how to rest. It is tempting to think this corruption is irreversible, but perhaps the old order still hums beneath the surface. The equinox still arrives with mathematical precision. The solstice still divides the year exactly as Uriel once described. The stars have not abandoned their gates, only we have stopped watching. The calendar of heaven still ticks in silence, waiting for humanity to remember the sound. Across the ages, a few have tried. In the deserts of Egypt, monastic communities kept their own rhythm, praying at hours aligned with the sun's ascent and descent. In the medieval cathedrals, stained glass windows were designed to catch equinox light precisely at the moment of dawn mass. Even now, remnants of the old pattern survive. The 7-day week, the 4 seasons, the festivals that trace faint outlines of their solar origins. The music of time has not vanished completely. It is only out of tune. The corruption of time is not simply a tale of calendars and emperors. It is the story of humanity's forgetfulness, the gradual silencing of the song that once united heaven and earth. To the ancients, time was sacred because it belonged to God. To us, it belongs to industry, to finance, to the clock on the wall. But perhaps that is why we still look to the stars, not just for beauty or science, but for rhythm. The constellations remind us of what the Caesars and popes could not erase. That creation keeps perfect time even when we do not. The angels set the dial and humanity rewired it. The result was subtle but profound, spiritual dissonance, a world perpetually out of sync with its own heartbeat. But every now and then, when we stand beneath a night sky or feel the balance of day and night on the equinox, we hear it again. That quiet pulse beneath the noise of history. It is the heartbeat of Genesis, still steady, still calling, still waiting for us to remember how to listen. For time, as the ancients knew, is not meant to serve us. It is meant to remind us that we serve something greater, a rhythm older than civilization, older than light and shadow, older even than the stars. And though the world has corrupted it, that rhythm endures, eternal, incorruptible, counting down to the day when the music of heaven and the calendars of men will once again become one. The corruption of time did not go unchallenged. In the dry wilderness of Judea, where the desert wind still carried the scent of salt and silence, a remnant of believers sought to rebuild what empire had broken. They were called the Essenes, a people of discipline, purity, and fierce devotion to order. To them, the loss of the divine calendar was not a mere clerical error. It was the greatest blasphemy of all. For when the count of time was corrupted, they believed, the sanctuary itself had fallen out of tune with heaven. Their writings, preserved in the caves near Qumran, speak of a priesthood obsessed not with ritual alone, but with precision. The Essenes measured everything, not out of superstition, but conviction, that the rhythm of worship must match the rhythm of creation. They believed that every song, every offering, every prayer had an appointed moment, and that moment could only be discerned through the true calendar revealed by the angels. To miscount even by a day was to play the wrong note in a symphony that spanned heaven and earth. Archaeologists studying the Qumran texts found within them a stunning revelation. The community had developed a priestly rotation of 24 courses, a sacred schedule that ensured continuous service in the temple throughout the year. This order mirrored the 24 heavenly elders described in the Book of Revelation, each one presiding before the throne, casting crowns, and singing without ceasing. To the Essenes, this was no coincidence. The pattern was deliberate. The priestly order below was meant to reflect the celestial order above. Each priestly course served for 1 week, then yielded to the next, completing a perfect cycle of 6 months before the rotation began anew. The names of these courses, Jehoiarib, Jediah, Harim, Seorim, and so on, were recorded not only as genealogies but as temporal anchors. Each represented an earthly counterpart to an angelic order. The priests, through their service, were not merely officiating rituals, they were synchronizing human worship with the heavenly clock. The Essenes believed that this correspondence extended far beyond the temple. They mapped the 24 priestly shifts onto the stars themselves. Each course was associated with a constellation, a marker in the night sky guiding the appointed times. Orion, Pleiades, Leo, and Virgo, the very constellations mentioned in the Book of Job, were not to them mythic symbols but part of a divine mechanism. The heavens, they believed, were the gears of God's great clock, and the priests were the hands that turned in harmony with it. In this system, the earthly sanctuary and the cosmos were two halves of the same instrument. When the priests performed their duties according to the correct order, creation resonated in perfect harmony. But when they strayed, when the calendar was altered, when the Sabbath shifted, when sacrifices were offered on the wrong day, dissonance entered both realms. The temple became impure and the world itself trembled. The Essenes called this corruption the defilement of time. To them, the priesthood in Jerusalem had become compromised. The high priests, appointed under foreign influence and governed by political alliances, had abandoned the angelic pattern. They followed the lunar calendar of the Babylonians and Romans, a system the Essenes considered profane. The result, they said, was that the temple had fallen under the dominion of darkness. Its sacrifices were no longer pleasing, its festivals no longer synchronized with the heavenly order. Their exodus to the desert, then, was not an act of retreat. It was protest. The Essenes saw themselves as the true sons of Zadok, the original priestly line established in the days of Solomon. When they left Jerusalem, they carried with them not only scrolls and laws, but the memory of the celestial calendar, the calendar of heaven. In their eyes, they were not abandoning worship, they were restoring it. Life at Qumran was built entirely around this restoration. Every activity, from prayer to work to rest, was scheduled according to the solar calendar of 364 days. The community observed precise divisions of time. Morning prayers aligned with the first light of dawn, afternoon meditations with the sun's zenith, evening psalms with the descent of twilight. They called each segment an appointed watch, echoing the watchtowers of heaven where angels guarded the hours. This devotion to temporal purity defined everything they did. Their festivals never shifted. Passover always fell on the same day of the week, a Tuesday. Pentecost always occurred 50 days later on the same weekday. The Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Booths, each landed in its appointed place. They did not bend time to convenience. They bent themselves to its divine architecture. Archaeologists later uncovered fragments known as the Mishmarot texts, detailed rosters mapping the 24 priestly divisions across the entire solar year. These documents revealed a staggering level of organization, a sacred bureaucracy of timekeeping that rivaled anything in the ancient world. Each priestly course was not only assigned a week of service, but tied to the corresponding season, constellation, and cosmic phase. It was clockwork theology, the marriage of astronomy, liturgy, and faith. One fragment describes how the names of the priests were inscribed beside the rising and setting of specific stars, ensuring that the temple's offerings coincided with celestial alignments. To modern eyes, it reads like a fusion of calendar and cosmos, part observatory, part sanctuary. But to the Essenes, it was far more profound. It was obedience. The Book of Revelation, written centuries later, seems to echo this vision. Its imagery of 24 elders, 7 lamps, and endless worship mirrors the very structure of the Qumran calendar. In that vision, heaven is not a place of chaos, but of order, perpetual motion synchronized with divine time. Whether the author of Revelation drew directly from Essene influence or from the same ancient well of Enochic tradition, the parallel is undeniable. The Essenes understood their role not as inventors of this order, but as its keepers. They called themselves the community of the renewed covenant, the sons of light, the watchers of the appointed times. They believed that by living in this perfect rhythm they were rehearsing for the age to come, the restoration of the true temple, the rejoining of heaven and earth. Their texts reveal an almost musical theology. They describe the angelic hosts as choirs rotating in harmony, each singing according to their season. The priests mirrored this on earth. One course would begin its chant as the other ended, an unbroken symphony of worship continuing day and night. Even their communal meals followed this rhythm, blessings over bread and wine recited in cadence with the sun's arc across the sky. To outsiders, this might have seemed obsessive or austere, but to the Essenes it was liberation. The world of empire was governed by chaos, war, greed, ambition, and corruption. In the desert, under the unchanging stars, they found a different kingdom. Time there was not tyranny but grace, a sacred river flowing in perfect measure, carrying them closer to the source. The deeper archaeologists and scholars studied their texts, the more apparent it became that the Essenes viewed time as a temple itself. Each day was a doorway, each week a chamber, each year a pilgrimage from light into darkness and back again. To walk through it faithfully was to ascend spiritually, to align one's soul with the architecture of the cosmos. In that sense, the calendar of heaven was not only a way of counting days toward us, it was a map of salvation. Even their prophecies followed this clockwork vision. The War Scroll, one of Qumran's most famous documents, speaks of an apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness that would unfold over exact periods. 7 years of preparation, 40 years of conflict, and a final jubilee of peace. Every number, every duration was intentional, tied to the geometry of divine time. For them, prophecy was not prediction but schedule. In their solitude, the Essenes believed they were keeping the world in balance. Every dawn prayer, every evening hymn was part of a vast correspondence between the seen and unseen. They imagined the angels watching with them, counting alongside them, ensuring that creation did not lose its pulse. Their community, though small, carried the weight of cosmic responsibility. But they also knew that the wider world would not understand. They expected persecution, misunderstanding, even destruction. In one fragment, a writer laments, "The priests of the house have forsaken the covenant, and the appointed times have been turned into confusion. But we shall not cease to count the weeks of light, for his order is everlasting." Those words read now like a vow written to eternity, a promise that even if the temple fell, the time of heaven would endure. And it did endure, though buried. When the scrolls were sealed in their caves, the priestly rotations ceased, the temple burned, and Rome's empire expanded. Yet somehow the rhythm they guarded survived in silence. The earth continued its orbit. The sun passed through its gates. The constellations wheeled through their courses. The cosmic clock did not stop simply because men forgot how to read it. The discovery of those scrolls 2,000 years later was not only an archaeological miracle, it was a resurrection of rhythm. Through them, the voice of a forgotten order spoke again. That worship is not confined to walls, that time itself can be sacred, and that every sunrise still rings with the echo of angelic counting. In their exile, the Essenes had not abandoned the world. They had become its timekeepers. And perhaps that is why their legacy still stirs something in us today. A quiet recognition that beneath our calendars and clocks, the ancient clockwork still ticks. The stars still turn, the seasons still breathe, and the same divine harmony still hums beneath the chaos of history. For the Essenes, this was the truest act of faith. To live in time as heaven intended. They believed that to keep the count was to keep creation itself from unraveling. And though their voices faded into the dust, the order they preserved, the 24 rotations, the rhythm of stars, the symmetry of light, remains written not only in scrolls but in the sky itself, where the calendar of heaven still turns, unbroken, unseen, unstoppable. When the desert winds still carried whispers of forgotten scrolls and the stars shone with the same steady rhythm that had guided the ancients, there lived a man whose name would become the bridge between heaven and earth. Enoch, the seventh from Adam. His story stands at the dawn of human memory, older than kings, older than prophecy, older even than written law. The scriptures say simply that he walked with God and was no more, but the apocryphal writings open that mystery wider. They tell us where he walked and what he saw when heaven opened its doors. According to the ancient texts, Enoch was not taken merely to behold divine glory. He was taken to study the structure of creation, the machinery of time itself. Guided by Uriel, the angel of light and order, Enoch ascended beyond the veil of the sky, through layers of radiance and fire, past the firmament where the stars dwell in silence. There he was shown how light obeys command, how seasons are measured not by chance but by decree, and how the turning of the heavens mirrors the turning of the spirit. In those celestial realms, time was not what men thought it to be. It did not flow like a river, but unfolded like a scroll. Every age, every generation was a line inscribed by the divine hand, and Enoch was permitted to read what few mortals ever would. He saw the gates of the sun, 12 in the east, 12 in the west, through which the light entered and departed. He saw chambers for the moon, where its phases were weighed and balanced, ensuring that it waxed and waned with mathematical precision. He saw stars arranged in circuits like jewels on a cosmic wheel, each guided by an angelic messenger who opened its path and sealed it again. Everything has its season, Uriel told him, and every season its messenger. The sun does not rise without command, nor the moon decline without witness. The law that governs the heavens governs the soul. As they moved through those halls of light, Enoch perceived something extraordinary, that the visible universe was only the surface of a deeper order. Beneath every sunrise and equinox ran invisible cords, threads of energy and intention that bound all things together. He was told that these were the cords of covenant, stretched between the Creator and creation. To disturb them was to invite chaos. To honor them was to dwell in harmony with God. In this revelation, time itself became sacred space. Every day, every hour was a doorway through which divine presence could enter. The Enochic vision thus transformed the human understanding of time, no longer a neutral measure of change, but a living architecture through which the divine will flowed. The angels were not symbols of mystery, they were engineers of order. They turned the gears of heaven so that light and darkness, day and night, seed time and harvest might each fulfill their appointed purpose. When Enoch looked upon this celestial machinery, he did not see lifeless astronomy. He saw worship in motion. He saw the stars bowing in their orbits, the moon praising in its fullness, the sun exalting in its ascent. All of creation was liturgy, every revolution a hymn. Humanity, he was told, had been created to join that worship by keeping the same rhythm. The calendar was not an invention of men, but an imitation of angels. Enoch's journey continued upward through the seven heavens, each one more radiant than the last. In the first, he saw the archives of time, where angels recorded the deeds of every soul. In the second, he saw the storehouses of the winds and rains guarded by fiery spirits. In the third, he saw the tree of life itself, its roots drinking from the waters of eternity. In the fourth, he entered the halls of light where the sun rested at night. In the fifth and sixth, he witnessed the watchers, those angels once tasked with observing the earth who had fallen from their station through desire. And in the seventh, he stood before the throne itself, where the Most High reigned amid flames of sapphire and voices of thunder. It was there, in that terrible beauty, that Enoch was given his commission. The Creator spoke through the radiance and said, "Write what you have seen, that those who dwell on earth may know my order." Uriel then placed before him tablets of stone, and upon them Enoch inscribed the measurements of the heavens, the days, the weeks, the months, the years. It was the first calendar written by human hand but dictated by heaven's voice. Those stones, tradition says, were hidden before the flood, sealed away so that the knowledge would not perish when judgment came. When the waters subsided and a new world emerged, fragments of that revelation would surface again. Among the patriarchs, in the wisdom of Abraham, and later in the priestly order of Zadok. But in Enoch's time it was still pure, untouched by empire or error. The Book of Enoch describes these writings as the tablets of the heavenly luminaries, and their precision remains astonishing even to modern scholars. They outline a solar year of 364 days, divided into 4 equal quarters, each containing 13 weeks. The same structure later preserved by the Essenes. It is a system of perfect symmetry designed not by human intellect but by divine geometry. Every festival, every Sabbath, every sacred moment falls exactly where it should, returning each year like the breath of God through creation. In later Jewish and Christian mysticism, Enoch's ascent became the archetype of revelation, the model of how knowledge descends from heaven to earth. He was the first human to understand that wisdom was not abstract, but architectural, woven into the fabric of time and matter. To know God was to perceive pattern. To obey God was to live in sync with that pattern. But not all knowledge is welcomed. According to the same traditions, Enoch's writings were both sacred and dangerous, for they unveiled the blueprint of creation, secrets that even angels guarded with reverence. Some said that the fallen watchers, those who had defied heaven, once possessed fragments of this knowledge and misused it, teaching mankind arts of power and vanity. Enoch's version, by contrast, was revelation purified, a reminder that wisdom must serve harmony, not ambition. In this way, Enoch became both prophet and scientist of the divine. His calendar was not superstition but a kind of cosmic physics, a theory of everything expressed in sacred time. Each day he taught corresponded to a virtue, each week to a stage of creation, each season to a phase in the soul's journey. Time was moral geometry, a reflection of spiritual alignment. To sin was to fall out of rhythm. To repent was to return to the beat of heaven. When Enoch returned from his ascent, he brought with him a burden as much as a blessing. He had seen the future of creation, the rise of corruption, the flood that would cleanse, the covenant that would renew. He wrote these visions on tablets, but not all were meant for every eye. Some he sealed, to be revealed only in later ages when humanity was ready to understand. The rest he entrusted to his sons, Methuselah and later Noah, who preserved them as the foundation of all wisdom traditions that would follow. The ancient rabbis said that before the flood came, Enoch's stones glowed with inner light, as though the rhythm of the cosmos still pulsed within them. When the waters rose, the tablets were hidden deep within the earth, awaiting rediscovery. Whether metaphor or miracle, the legend holds a haunting truth. That knowledge, once given by heaven, never truly dies. It waits. Centuries later, echoes of Enoch's revelations would appear everywhere. In the solar rituals of Egypt, in the ziggurats of Babylon aligned to the stars, in the temple architecture of Israel built upon celestial ratios. Even Greek philosophers would unknowingly echo his vision when they spoke of a universe ordered by harmony and number. But only in the desert scrolls of Qumran would the full rhythm re-emerge, traced directly back to his count of days and his law of light. Modern astronomers reading the Enochic calendar have marveled at its accuracy. It predicts equinoxes and solstices with minimal deviation, using cycles that anticipate later astronomical discoveries by millennia. Yet its purpose was never mere calculation. For Enoch, timekeeping was devotion, an act of remembrance. To count the days rightly was to acknowledge that every sunrise is a covenant renewed, every sunset a promise kept. The power of that vision endures. It whispers through the ages that creation is not chaos but choreography, that every orbit and heartbeat moves to the same silent rhythm. Enoch's ascent was not escape, it was initiation. He did not flee the world to abandon it. He went to learn its hidden music so that humanity could one day sing it again. Perhaps that is why his story refuses to fade. Though his writings were excluded from canon and buried under centuries of theology, they resurface again and again. In apocrypha, in mysticism, in science. Every generation that looks upward at the stars repeats unknowingly his first lesson, that the heavens are not random and that light moves according to law. Enoch's ascent, then, was not a miracle of distance but of perception. He did not climb ladders of light to escape mortality. He saw eternity unfold within it. And when he returned, he brought with him the blueprint of time, a map written in starlight and sealed in stone, waiting for the day when humanity would once more remember how to read it. The ancients say that before he vanished, Enoch spoke one final line to those who followed him. Keep the count, for the count keeps you. Perhaps that is the truest summary of his legacy. That the keeping of time is itself an act of faith, and that every age which forgets this truth must rediscover it the hard way. And so his hidden stones became legend. Markers buried beneath flood and empire, beneath language and forgetting. But the rhythm they carried still beats in the heart of creation. For though empires rewrite calendars and kings rename months, the sun still rises through 12 gates, the moon still sings its silver hymn, and the machinery of time still hums as it did on the day Enoch first heard it. The echo of eternity turning through the silence of the stars. The tablets that Enoch carved were said to glow faintly before the flood, as if the breath of heaven pulsed within them. When he vanished from the earth, their light dimmed, and soon the world below began to forget the pattern they held. Generations passed, and humanity, now scattered across valleys and plains, still tilled, built, and multiplied. But they no longer counted the days by the rhythm of the heavens. The watchers had fallen, the sons of men had taken knowledge they could not control, and the balance between earth and sky grew thin. The ancients said that in those days even the stars wept. for the world's heartbeat had gone out of time. Then came the flood. According to ancient reckoning, it did not begin in chaos, it began on schedule. The book of Genesis, when read through the lens of Enoch's calendar, reveals that the flood's timing followed exact intervals, beginning on the 17th day of the second month and ending on the 27th of the same, 1 solar year later. To the untrained eye, these might appear as random dates, but to those who knew the calendar of heaven, they meant something precise. These were equinox points within the 364-day solar cycle, the very turning of cosmic balance. Judgment, they realized, had not erupted without order. It had unfolded according to the mathematics of divine timing. The flood in this light was not only an act of destruction but of correction, the resetting of creation's clock. The world, once governed by harmony, had fallen into dissonance. The sons of men had corrupted the count of days and forgotten the appointed times. They built cities that defied the rhythms of the sun and worshipped under moons that no longer matched the divine cycle. When mercy expired and the heavens broke open, it was not merely rain that fell. It was time itself washing away error. In the Book of Jubilees, a text that preserves Enoch's calendaric vision, the flood narrative is given with remarkable precision. The author insists that the deluge began on the exact day the sun crossed the gate of its second season, a calculated moment of cosmic symmetry. It was as if creation itself exhaled, releasing its imbalance in water. When Noah and his family entered the ark, they were not simply escaping destruction, they were stepping back into alignment. The ark became a moving sanctuary of restored time, floating between heaven's mercy and earth's renewal. Every detail of that story, when viewed through the lens of the heavenly calendar, carries deeper resonance. The 40 days of rain, 6 weeks minus 2 days, correspond to a full cycle of divine testing, echoing the 6 days of creation and the 7th of rest. The 150 days during which the waters prevailed mark precisely half of a solar year, dividing judgment and restoration in equal measure. Even the date of the ark's resting, the 17th day of the 7th month, aligns with the beginning of a new solar quarter. To those who studied the ancient cycles, none of this was coincidence. Judgment, like mercy, kept perfect time. The flood, then, was a reckoning not merely of flesh but of rhythm. When the sons of men lost the calendar of heaven, they ceased to know when mercy began or when warning would end. They could not hear the ticking of divine patience, nor recognize the appointed hour of repentance. They measured life by seasons of desire, not by the sacred sevens that marked creation's balance. Thus, when the flood came, it caught them unprepared, not because they had not been warned, but because they no longer knew how to count. The ancient rabbis taught that the ark was itself built according to heavenly measurements, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high, ratios that corresponded to the proportions of the cosmos as revealed to Enoch. Even its construction was a sermon in time. The 300 represented the days of a solar year, the 50, the jubilee of release, the 30, the days of the moon's course. It was a microcosm of creation, a vessel that contained not only life but the geometry of divine order. When the rains descended, it was as though God had folded the world back into its blueprint, cleansing it of the chaos that had distorted its form. Inside the ark, Noah kept a record of days. The Book of Jubilees says he marked every sunrise and sunset, every phase of the moon and every shift of the stars. He kept the sacred count as Enoch had done, ensuring that the new world would begin in rhythm once more. To Noah, the flood was not only survival, it was stewardship. He was the keeper of the reset. When the waters receded and the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat, Noah stepped out into a world that smelled of beginnings. The first thing he did was build an altar and offer sacrifice, According to the old reckoning, this moment aligned precisely with the autumnal equinox. The same balance of light and darkness that had marked the dawn of creation. The flood had undone corruption not merely in the flesh of man, but in the measure of time. Heaven and earth were once again synchronized. The covenant that followed, the rainbow arcing across the sky, was more than a symbol of peace. It was a calendar made visible, a sevenfold band of color reminding the world of the sevenfold rhythm of divine mercy. The rainbow was heaven's clock reappearing in light, the visible signature of invisible order. While the earth remains, God said, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. That was not simply a promise of stability, it was a restoration of rhythm. The flood in this way was both judgment and renewal. The cleansing of corrupted time and the re-establishment of divine synchronization. Humanity had been given a second chance not just to live, but to count correctly. Yet as generations passed and memory faded, even that gift began to erode. The descendants of Noah spread across the earth, but their languages, calendars, and customs diverged. The common rhythm fractured again. Some nations followed lunar months, others worshipped the stars. The unity that had once tied human time to heaven's light was scattered like sand in the wind. Still, echoes of the flood's calendar remained. In ancient Mesopotamia, flood epics like the Epic of Gilgamesh preserved fragments of the timing. The same 7 days of waiting before the storm, the same 40 days of rain, the same dove and raven sent in sequence. The Babylonians counted their years in cycles of 7. The Egyptians built temples aligned to solstices. Even faraway cultures kept memories of a deluge tied to celestial signs. It was as if the whole world carried the memory of a cosmic reset, dimly remembering that the heavens once kept perfect time with the earth. To the priests of Qumran, these patterns were confirmation that Enoch's calendar was true, that divine judgment, even in its wrath, had obeyed the same celestial order. They believed that every future reckoning would do the same. When God acted in history, he did so on appointed days. Days known to the watchers, inscribed in the cycles of light. Redemption and destruction alike moved according to the same clock. For everything under heaven, they wrote, has its time appointed by God. Modern scholars who have studied the Enochic calendar are struck by its precision. It predicts not only solar transitions, but patterns of rainfall and agricultural fertility. The flood narrative, when mapped onto this system, reveals correlations too precise to dismiss as myth. The 17th day of the second month aligns with the setting of the Pleiades, a constellation long associated with the opening of the rainy season in the ancient Near East. The 27th of the second month 1 year later coincides with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the star of renewal and harvest. The story of Noah, seen through this lens, is as much astronomy as theology. It is the cosmos keeping covenant. But what happens when that covenant is forgotten? The Book of Enoch warned that in later generations, when humanity would once again abandon the true count, the world would slip back into confusion. Without the divine rhythm, the boundaries between sacred and profane would blur. Time would become mechanical, history directionless. Judgment, when it came again, would catch mankind unaware, not because God had hidden his timing, but because humanity had ceased to recognize his clock. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of forgetting heaven's calendar. Not that we lose track of dates, but that we lose awareness of the heartbeat behind them. We rush through years as if they were empty numbers, never realizing that each cycle still breathes with divine purpose. The flood story endures not merely as a warning against corruption, but as a reminder of timing, that even wrath has order, and that mercy too comes on schedule. In every generation, the equinox returns. day and night balanced, creation momentarily poised in perfect symmetry. The ancients believed that in those hours heaven draws near again, as it did in the days of Noah, inviting humanity to realign. The flood's lesson was not only remember righteousness, but remember rhythm. For those who kept the count, the message was clear. Judgment and mercy are not random, they move according to appointed seasons. The deluge that cleansed the earth was not chaos unleashed, but order restored. The washing away of dissonance so that creation could find its measure once more. When the rain stopped and the rainbow appeared, it was as if heaven whispered through the light, "The count begins again." And perhaps even now, every time we see that arc across the sky, it is more than beauty we are witnessing. It is memory. It is the echo of Enoch's calendar, the proof that divine timing still governs the world, whether we remember it or not. For the flood was never simply an ending, it was a resetting of the clock. A reminder that time belongs not to empires, not to kings, not even to man, but to God. And though humanity has tried for millennia to master it, time remains faithful only to the one who first measured light with word and motion. The waters may have receded, but the reckoning they carried still ripples through every sunrise and tide. A pulse reminding creation to stay in rhythm with the calendar of heaven. When the waters of the flood receded and the rainbow shone as covenant, humanity began again. But memory, like a fragile reed, bends easily to wind. The generations that followed Noah carried echoes of the old knowledge, faint and fractured, scattered like shards of light across civilizations. They still looked to the heavens, still built their calendars from the motion of stars and moons, but the spirit that once infused their count had changed. What had been revelation became curiosity. What had once been worship became study. And though the words of Enoch faded into legend, his vision of the cosmos continued to haunt human thought like a half-remembered dream. Centuries later, in the lands between the rivers, new empires rose from the dust. Babylon, with its towers of brick and bitumen, became the first great city of observation. Its priests studied the heavens night after night, tracing the paths of planets, naming the constellations, predicting eclipses. They believed the stars carried messages from the gods, that destiny itself could be read in their movements. But beneath their clay tablets and cuneiform charts lay something older, the remnants of a system first whispered by Uriel to Enoch, refracted now through empire and myth. The Babylonians measured the sky with extraordinary precision. They divided the year into 12 parts, each governed by a constellation, the zodiac, and calculated the synodic months of the moon with accuracy that astonishes modern scholars. Yet their purpose was no longer to align with divine harmony, but to manipulate fate. Astrology replaced angelic order. What Enoch had called the law of the luminaries, the obedience of creation to its maker, became, in Babylon's hands, a means to forecast human fortune. Heaven was still a clock, but now men imagined they could wind it themselves. From Babylon, this celestial knowledge spread east and west. In Persia, the followers of Zoroaster reinterpreted it through their own lens of dualism. They spoke of Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, and his archangelic host maintaining the order of time against the chaos of Ahriman. Each day, month, and year had its guardian spirit, a Yazata, who ensured that light would prevail. The Zoroastrians built their calendar on the sun's cycle. 365 days divided into 12 months, with 5 days set apart for the remembrance of creation. To them, the keeping of time was a sacred duty, a moral act that upheld cosmic balance. Yet even in their piety, something was missing. Their angels were no longer living custodians of creation's rhythm but abstractions, symbols of an ethical struggle between order and disorder. The living covenant that Enoch had seen, The breathing musical harmony of heaven had hardened into doctrine. The knowledge remained, but the awe was gone. Meanwhile, to the west, in the libraries of Greece, philosophers began to rediscover fragments of the same ancient truth. Pythagoras spoke of the music of the spheres, claiming that the planets as they moved emitted tones, a cosmic harmony inaudible to human ears, but real nonetheless. Plato wrote in his Timaeus that the soul of the world was structured according to mathematical intervals, and that the Creator had arranged the heavens like a perfect scale of music. Aristotle described time as the number of motion, measured by the circling stars. They did not name Enoch, nor Uriel, nor the heavenly gates, but their ideas echoed the same revelation in another tongue. The Greeks saw divinity in geometry. They built temples aligned with solstices, calculated the lengths of shadows to measure the earth, and mapped the heavens with such precision that modern astronomers still use their constellations. Yet their pursuit of knowledge, like the watchers before them, drifted toward pride. The more they understood, the less they worshipped. They sought to explain the cosmos, not adore its maker. The wisdom that had once humbled angels now inflated men. In Alexandria, where Greek intellect met Egyptian mystery, the old Enochian thread shimmered again, though few recognized it. The city's scholars preserved vast scrolls of astronomy and philosophy, merging Babylonian charts, Egyptian star lore, and Greek mathematics into a single system. They spoke of celestial spheres, nested and rotating, moved by unseen intelligences, diamonds or logoi. Some whispered that these were the same beings who once revealed the secrets of the stars to early mankind. Others warned that such speculation bordered on blasphemy. But curiosity proved stronger than caution. Humanity once again was reaching for the forbidden. What began as reverent observation soon became mastery. Astronomers such as Hipparchus and later Ptolemy codified the heavens into equations. The stars became coordinates, the planets subjects of calculation. Ptolemy's Almagest, a masterpiece of ancient science, turned the heavens into a map so precise that it ruled the world's understanding of astronomy for over 1,000 years. But in doing so, it stripped the sky of its sanctity. The spheres still sang, but no one listened for the melody. In the East, another tradition was forming, one that would soon inherit both the mathematics of Greece and the mysticism of Persia. When the Islamic world rose in the 7th century, it did so with a deep hunger for knowledge. The Quran itself speaks of the heavens as signs, ayat, for those who reflect. It honors time as sacred, declaring that God is the reckoner of days and that the moon was appointed for the measure of months. Early Islamic scholars, inspired by both revelation and inheritance, became the greatest astronomers of their age. They charted lunar cycles, recorded solstices, and calculated the inclination of the ecliptic with astonishing accuracy. Men like al-Battani, al-Farghani, and later Ibn al-Haytham studied the movement of celestial bodies with tools and precision the ancients could only dream of. But even they, in their devotion to order, preserved faint traces of the old angelic language. Islamic cosmology spoke of malaika, angels appointed over creation, one for the sun, one for the moon, one for every star. Each was said to guard its path and ensure obedience to divine law. The Quran echoed Uriel's ancient teaching in another voice. The sun runs on its fixed course. This is the decree of the Almighty, the All-Knowing. Here for a moment science and reverence coexisted. The scholars of Baghdad built observatories not merely for curiosity but for worship, to witness the precision of God's handiwork. They saw astronomy as a form of remembrance, a way to glimpse divine perfection. But as the centuries advanced, even that humility began to fade. Calculation replaced contemplation. Observation became empire's instrument, used for navigation, taxation, and conquest. The stars that once told stories of angels now mark trade routes and borders. It is a strange irony of history that the very knowledge which had once caused angels to fall now became the foundation of human enlightenment. What had begun as divine revelation to Enoch, the pattern of time, the harmony of the spheres, returned through the pens of philosophers, priests, and astronomers who no longer knew its source. The Watcher's wisdom, long buried by the flood, had resurfaced, but stripped of its awe. Humanity had reclaimed the heavens, but not the humility that should have accompanied them. The Zoroastrian Yazatas became the Greek daimons, which became the Islamic angels of astronomy, and later the Renaissance intelligences of the celestial spheres. The names changed, but the architecture remained. The same revelation, that the universe is law, that light moves by measure, that every cycle is sacred, echoed through every age. Yet each retelling lost a little more of the reverence that once held it in balance. By the Middle Ages, the old Enochian current had fractured into three streams: mysticism, philosophy, and science. The mystics sought to rediscover the spiritual harmony of creation through prayer and contemplation. The philosophers reduced that harmony to abstract principles, and the scientists, descendants of both, sought to measure it, to harness it, to use it. The heavens, once a sanctuary, became a laboratory. And yet, even in this transformation, traces of the original voice remained. When Johannes Kepler, many centuries later, described the motion of planets as a divine song, each orbit a note in God's composition, he was unknowingly echoing the first whisper of Uriel, that the heavens are music made visible. When Newton wrote that the universe operated according to immutable laws, he was restating the same truth that Enoch had inscribed on his glowing tablets. That order is divine. But unlike Enoch, they did not kneel before the revelation. They measured it. The return of the Watcher's knowledge was both a gift and a warning. For every ascent brings the risk of another fall. Humanity, like those angels before them, began to believe that knowledge alone could redeem them, that to understand creation was to master it. The line between reverence and rebellion grew thin once more. The stars no longer testified to God, they testified to man's intelligence. And so the cycle repeated. What began as divine communication became human computation. What began as worship became curiosity, and curiosity left unanchored by awe became ambition. The heavens, which once taught humility, now reflected our hunger for control. Still, beneath all this, something of the old rhythm endures. The patterns discovered by the Babylonians, the harmonies described by the Greeks, the calculations of the Persians and Arabs, all still trace the same architecture that Enoch saw when Uriel lifted his eyes to the gates of the sun. The knowledge remains true. What has changed is the heart that receives it. For the Watchers fell not because they knew, but because they forgot why they knew. They sought wisdom without worship, mastery without mercy. And every time humanity rediscovers their secrets, it faces the same test. Whether to see in the stars its own reflection or the reflection of God. Perhaps that is why the ancients said the heavens declare his glory. Not to warn us away from knowledge, but to remind us that light and law must always move together. The music of the spheres still plays as it did when Enoch first heard it. The question is whether we still listen with reverence or only with calculation. For knowledge without awe, like light without warmth, illuminates, but does not heal. It was never the stars that led the angels astray. It was pride, and pride, whether angelic or human, always begins the same way, by forgetting that the calendar of heaven was never meant to be conquered, only kept. The rediscovery of Enoch's calendar, long buried beneath millennia of theological dust, has begun to awaken new questions among scholars, not only about the past, but about the very structure of prophecy itself. For centuries, theologians treated time in Scripture as metaphor, assuming its numbers and dates carried moral symbolism rather than literal synchronization. But now, as researchers trace the hidden mathematics of ancient reckoning, a pattern begins to shimmer beneath the surface, a rhythm that beats faintly but persistently through the pages of sacred history. It began as a curiosity. Archaeologists examining the Dead Sea Scrolls noticed that the solar calendar used by the Essenes, the same one Enoch recorded from Uriel, divided the year into 4 equal quarters, each beginning on a Wednesday, the day of the sun's creation. Each quarter contained exactly 13 weeks, 91 days. 4 of these quarters produced a year of 364 days, the perfect symmetry of sevens. The ancients had called it the calendar of the covenant, believing that every divine event, from creation to redemption, unfolded according to its rhythm. Modern theologians, comparing these cycles with biblical events, began to notice something startling. The great turning points of Scripture often fell precisely on the same days marked as quarter changes in the Enochic count. It was as though the divine author had kept his own time, and that time, though obscured by centuries of lunar and Roman reform, still pulsed beneath the text. Take, for example, the Exodus, the night when the first Passover was kept. According to ancient reckoning, it occurred on the 14th day of the first month, just before the beginning of a new quarter of the solar year. The crucifixion of Christ, according to the Gospel timeline, aligns with that same day and same season more than 1,000 years later. The resurrection 3 days later falls on the first day of a new week and astonishingly on the same solar boundary that marked creation's renewal in Genesis. Coincidence, some say. But to those who know the rhythm, it feels like recognition. The pattern is the message. The Book of Jubilees insists that the festivals and prophecies of Israel were not random commemorations but reflections of heavenly cycles. For there will be those who will make observations of the moon, it warns, and it will disturb the seasons. The writer laments that when humanity abandoned the solar covenant for lunar reckoning, sacred time began to drift. Feasts shifted. Harvests no longer matched their signs, and prophecy, once anchored to precise days, became blurred. The lunar calendar, governed by the changing phases of darkness, was, in the eyes of Enoch's heirs, a symbol of spiritual confusion. Only the solar calendar, constant, balanced, unchanging, reflected divine order. So when modern researchers began replotting biblical chronology using the Enochic solar framework, they found alignments too intricate to ignore. The flood narrative, as we saw, fits perfectly into a 364-day year. The Exodus fits. The wilderness wanderings with their 40-year intervals and Sabbath cycles fit. Even the construction of Solomon's temple, begun and completed on equinox boundaries, fits. Each major covenantal event falls at precise intervals of 7 or multiple sevens. The rhythm of divine architecture written into time itself. But what startled scholars most was not the past, it was how the pattern extended forward. Prophetic texts, long thought symbolic, began to reveal a structure of timing, not arbitrary but mathematical. Daniel's 70 weeks suddenly made more sense when read as 70 jubilees of solar years, each of 49 years, aligning perfectly with historical milestones in Israel's story. The prophetic time, times, and half a time in Daniel and Revelation, phrases long debated, mirrored exact divisions in the Enochic calendar. The same rhythm that marked the flood, the Exodus, and the cross seemed to be counting still towards something yet to come. One researcher mapping these intervals called it the prophetic metronome. Another described it as the divine clock that never stopped ticking. Their findings suggested that sacred history was not a collection of isolated events, but a symphony of appointments, each movement returning to a hidden refrain. It was as though time itself were composed in music, and Scripture, when read in this light, became the score. Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, the three great feasts of Israel, all fall on the same weekdays each year in the Enochic system because its structure never drifts. Passover begins on a Tuesday evening, the day the sun was set to rule the heavens. Pentecost always arrives 50 days later on a Sunday, the day of resurrection. Tabernacles begins in the same week as creation's completion. Each of these is both celebration and prophecy, past memory and future rehearsal. When Christ celebrated his final Passover, the heavenly clock was turning precisely as it had since the first. The crucifixion in this view was not accidental in its timing, but intentional. The alignment of redemption with creation's rhythm, and the resurrection, rising with the dawn of the new quarter, fulfills the same pattern that governed Enoch's vision. Light emerging from darkness, life from stillness, morning from night. Even the 40 days between resurrection and ascension correspond to a sacred count. 6 weeks minus 2 days, echoing the same span of purification and renewal seen after the flood. The symmetry is too precise to ignore. To those who keep the modern Gregorian calendar, such patterns seem invisible. Our months vary in length. Our years drift around the solar cycle. Our holy days shift from season to season. We live in borrowed time, efficient, yes, but out of tune. Yet when Scripture is read according to the Enochic order, coherence returns. The feasts align again with the equinoxes and solstices. Prophecy finds rhythm. It is as though the text breathes again in the language it was first written in. Light. Some scholars have gone further, proposing that even the birth and ministry of Christ were timed according to this hidden order. They note that the Annunciation, Conception, and Nativity all align with solar quarter markers. The Annunciation near the spring equinox, the birth near the winter solstice, the moment when the light begins to return. The symbolism is ancient, the true sun rising after the longest night. These are not the inventions of later tradition, they argue, but reflections of a design older than empire. A design first revealed in Eden when light was divided from darkness. If that pattern still governs prophecy, then the future may already be written. Not in random years or human calendars, but in the cadence of Enoch's count. The final redemption, the restoration of creation, may come not when the world's clocks predict it, but when the heavenly rhythm completes its cycle. Some have even suggested that Revelation itself is structured on this 364-day pattern. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, each representing 1/7 of a prophetic year, culminating in the new heaven and new earth, where time and eternity meet again. The deeper one looks, the more Scripture seems to hum with this hidden code. The genealogies, the ages of patriarchs, the durations of kings, all appear to follow the arithmetic of sevens and jubilees. Even the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation with its 24 elders and 12 gates mirrors the divisions of the Enochic calendar. 12 months, 24 priestly rotations, all encircling the throne of light. The Bible, seen through this lens, becomes not merely a book of faith, but a cosmic calendar, a record of God's appointments with history. To some, this idea feels dangerous, too mechanical, too deterministic. But to others it offers comfort, the assurance that nothing unfolds by accident, that even chaos obeys a hidden order. When wars erupt, when kingdoms rise and fall, when the world drifts into darkness, the ancient rhythm continues untouched. To everything there is a season, wrote Ecclesiastes, a time to be born and a time to die. Those were not poetic metaphors. They were echoes of the same truth Uriel spoke to Enoch, that every season has its messenger. Perhaps this is why prophecy often feels circular, why history seems to repeat, because the heavenly clock is not linear but cyclical. The same gates open again and again, inviting repentance, renewal, and revelation. The flood, the exodus, the exile, the cross, all are movements in the same recurring symphony. And if that pattern holds, then every end is also a beginning, every judgment a prelude to mercy. Modern researchers now find themselves standing where Enoch once stood, staring into the machinery of time, trying to decipher its gears. Computers replace tablets of stone, telescopes replace visions of light, yet the wonder remains the same. The more they measure, the more they glimpse design. The universe, they admit, is not random. It operates according to laws of astonishing precision, laws that seem almost musical. And though they speak in the language of physics, their conclusions echo theology, that creation moves in order, and order implies intention. Could it be, then, that the same cadence which once ruled Eden still governs the rise and fall of nations? That prophecy itself is the unfolding of a rhythm too vast for centuries to erase? The Enochic calendar, with its perfect balance of light and season, may not have been a primitive artifact at all. It may have been a key to reading time as God reads it. And if that is true, then the future is not chaos waiting to happen, but melody waiting to resolve. The patterns of Scripture, long dismissed as coincidence, may yet reveal the timing of events still to come. The question is not whether prophecy will be fulfilled, but whether we will be listening when the next quarter turns, when the next appointed season opens, when the rhythm of heaven once again aligns with the world below. For the clock of God, unlike ours, has never stopped. It still turns silently, just as it did in the beginning. 364 days, 4 perfect quarters, one unbroken covenant of light. And in that rhythm, hidden in plain sight, the story of history, Synodio Motsixti, and perhaps its end, is already written. If the hidden code of Scripture was the rhythm of heaven, then prophecy was its voice. From the deserts of Babylon to the Isles of Patmos, the great seers of the Bible spoke in the language of time. Daniel, Ezekiel, John, each vision they received was measured not merely in symbols, but in seasons. 70 weeks, 1,260 days, 42 months. Every image, every trumpet, every seal, every judgment was framed in the precision of a clock that only heaven could keep. To the prophets, time was not a neutral medium through which history passed. It was a living covenant, a divine heartbeat that measured righteousness and rebellion alike. When Daniel stood in the courts of Babylon, he was not merely interpreting dreams of kings. He was decoding the timetable of creation. His visions, like those of Enoch before him, revealed that every empire, every fall, and every deliverance was written in rhythm long before it unfolded on earth. The 70 weeks prophecy, one of the most mysterious passages in all Scripture, was not a random calculation. It was a restatement of the Jubilee pattern, 7 times 7 years multiplied tenfold, describing a complete cycle of judgment and renewal. From the decree to rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of the Messiah, Daniel saw history laid out like an illuminated scroll. The very number 70 reflected the completion of divine patience. When the 70 weeks were fulfilled, the calendar of heaven would reset. Redemption would enter time. But to understand these prophecies, one had to understand the calendar itself. Daniel, trained in Babylonian astronomy, yet faithful to Israel's God, stood between two worlds. One ruled by lunar reckoning and omen reading, the other by solar covenant and revelation. When he recorded his visions, he used the language of both, days and weeks, moons and seasons, not as contradictions but as bridges between heaven's order and man's confusion. His words became the key for generations who sought to synchronize faith with time. Centuries later, when John wrote his revelation on the island of Patmos, he continued the same pattern. Every vision he saw unfolded according to temporal precision. The beast was given authority for 42 months. The witnesses prophesied for 1,260 days. The woman fled into the wilderness for a time, times, and half a time. These were not poetic abstractions. They were mathematical intervals. Exact divisions of the 364-day cycle first revealed to Enoch. John, steeped in Hebrew prophecy, was describing not chaos, but countdown. The ancients understood what modern readers often miss, that prophecy is not prediction but appointment. Every revelation was tethered to an appointed season and mode, a moment already marked in heaven's calendar. When Isaiah declared, "In an acceptable time I have heard you," he was invoking this very concept. The end, therefore, was not merely a culmination of events but a synchronization, the moment when heaven's rhythm would finally overtake the broken clocks of earth. For the early church, this idea was both hope and hazard. In the centuries after Christ's resurrection, believers faced persecution under Rome, their gatherings outlawed, their scriptures confiscated. Yet even as the empire sought to erase their faith, they clung to one conviction: that time itself belonged to God, not Caesar. The Roman calendar marked the days of empire, festivals for emperors, victories, and gods. But Christians measured time differently. In the catacombs and hidden homes, they recalibrated their feasts to what they believed was the true reckoning of heaven. Passover was no longer simply a remembrance of Egypt, but the commemoration of the cross, aligned once more with the ancient quarter markers of creation. Pentecost became the sign of renewed breath, 50 days after the resurrection, as in the Enochic pattern. Even their week retained the Sabbath rhythm, unbroken from Genesis, defying the lunar cycles of Rome. To keep this calendar was to resist empire itself. It was an act of spiritual rebellion, a declaration that Caesar did not own the hours or the seasons. Church fathers such as Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and Clement of Alexandria wrestled deeply with the question of time. They studied Daniel's 70 weeks and John's 1,000-year reign, trying to reconcile divine chronology with human calendars. Hippolytus, writing in the 3rd century, argued that the age of the world followed a 6,000-year pattern. 6 days of labor followed by a 7th millennium of rest, the Sabbath of history. It was the same theology of time found in Enoch and Jubilees extended to the very span of existence. The world, he said, was nearing its 6th day. The end would come not in chaos but in perfect symmetry, a cosmic Sabbath when creation would rest once more in its maker. Yet others warned of the danger of calculation. Augustine, centuries later, cautioned that trying to translate heavenly time into human measurement could lead to arrogance. "The times and seasons belong to the Father," he wrote, echoing Christ's words to his disciples. But even Augustine could not escape the fascination. He saw history itself as divided by divine rhythm, the ages of promise, law, grace, and glory, each fulfilling its appointed measure. Still, among the persecuted, the desire to keep the true calendar never faded. In secret, communities of believers marked their days according to patterns preserved by those desert priests of Qumran. They observed their feasts not by the lunar count of Rome, but by the solar quarters of the Enochic year. Their reasoning was simple. If Christ was the fulfillment of the covenant, then his life, death, and resurrection must have unfolded according to the same heavenly schedule that governed creation. To return to that count was to prepare for his return. In whispered gatherings, they spoke of the prophets of the last calendar, those who, like Daniel, could read the signs of the times. They studied the skies not for omens but for alignment. watching the equinoxes and solstices, noting how the feasts corresponded to celestial balance. To them, the return of the true reckoning would signal the approach of the Messiah's reign, when time itself would be restored to its original purity. In the catacombs beneath Rome, inscriptions reveal faint traces of this hope. Early Christian symbols, the fish, the anchor, the chi rho, are often carved beside stars, suns, and moons. These were not random decorations, they were reminders that faith was cosmic, that the Creator who set the lights in the heavens was the same Lord who would return to restore them. Even their worship followed rhythm. Prayers at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours mirrored the solar divisions of the day. The very structure of the liturgy was an echo of the old angelic clockwork. Over time, however, the imperial church absorbed Rome's calendar, fixing its feasts according to imperial decree. Easter became movable, detached from the fixed solar pattern. Christmas was set at the winter solstice to replace pagan festivals. Slowly, the church's time merged with Caesar's. Yet underground in monasteries and mystical sects, remnants of the old reckoning survived. Monks in the Egyptian desert still prayed at equinox hours. Celtic Christians in the north timed their liturgies by sunrise and solstice. They kept the count quietly, believing that heaven's rhythm would one day break through again. When persecution reached its height, believers began to see prophecy not as prediction, but as preparation. The 42 months of tribulation, the 1260 days of witness, these were not arbitrary durations. They were reminders that God's timing governed even suffering. The faithful understood that the end was not a date to be discovered, but a pattern to be lived. To endure was to stay in rhythm. For them, time itself became a form of worship. Every morning was a miniature resurrection, every week a rehearsal of eternity. When they read John's words, "Blessed is he who keeps the words of this prophecy," they heard not only a call to obedience but to synchronization. To keep prophecy was to keep the calendar of heaven, to live in harmony with divine order even while empires marched to their own dissonant clocks. Through the centuries, mystics and visionaries would continue to interpret history through these temporal patterns. The prophetic timelines of Joachim of Fiore in the 12th century, the apocalyptic calculations of the reformers, even the numerologies of modern prophecy teachers, all knowingly or not trace their lineage to this ancient conviction. That time is divine structure and that redemption moves by measure. The prophets of the last calendar did not claim to know the exact day or hour of the end. What they sought was alignment, to live so attuned to heaven's rhythm that when the final trumpet sounded, they would already be moving in time with its call. They believed that when the true reckoning returned, so would the Messiah, not because their calculations forced his hand, but because restoration and return are one and the same. Perhaps that is what prophecy truly means. Not foretelling the future, but remembering the original harmony. When Daniel counted 70 weeks, when John recorded 1260 days, they were not predicting random intervals, they were mapping the restoration of rhythm, the slow, patient retuning of creation. And so the question passed from generation to generation. When will the true calendar return? Not the Gregorian clock or the Roman year, but the divine order in which light and law once moved together. The early believers answered it not with mathematics, but with devotion. They prayed, they waited, they kept the count, for in their own hearts, they knew that the sound of the Messiah's return would not come as thunder from the sky, but as the quiet click of a clock long silent, beginning again to tick in perfect harmony with heaven. After centuries of prophecy, persecution, and recalibration, the world had learned to measure almost everything, except the silence. Numbers could count days, clocks could track orbits, and empires could legislate calendars, but none could capture the pause between them. the stillness that ancient sages called the space where God breathes. For in every rhythm there is rest, in every cycle a moment between pulses when motion stops and meaning listens. The prophets called it waiting. The mystics called it contemplation. The Enochic tradition called it the hour before dawn. The silence between hours was never empty. It was the most charged moment of all. When the early keepers of sacred time spoke of balance, they meant not only the equinox or the midpoint of seasons, but the spiritual balance between noise and stillness, between knowing and not knowing. They believed that within that infinitesimal pause between heaven's ticks, the breath between the turning of light and shadow, lay the true dwelling place of revelation. Over centuries, this understanding began to vanish. Humanity learned to count seconds but forgot how to hear silence. When the Gregorian reform replaced the old solar system with its new precision, it succeeded in ordering the calendar but not the soul. Time became continuous, mechanical, merciless. The new world could predict eclipses and solstices, but it could no longer perceive the divine rhythm behind them. The heavenly clock still turned, but humanity's ear for its intervals had gone deaf. And yet, across the ages, a few continued to listen. The monks of the early desert understood this silence as the final discipline. They rose before dawn, long before the sun touched the horizon, not to speak but to wait. In that pre-dawn hush, they sought what no hourglass could measure, the still point where creation seemed to hold its breath. They called it the vigil, the hour between yesterday and today, when prayer was neither request nor praise, but pure listening. They believed that eternity brushed against the mortal world in those quiet moments, and that the soul could sense the turning of God's unseen gears. Mystics in later centuries described the same phenomenon in their own language. To Meister Eckhart, the German theologian of the 14th century, the silence between hours was the birth of the word in the soul. He taught that the divine speaks most clearly when all other voices are still. The rhythm of history, he said, is not linear but circular. Each revelation followed by a pause, each act of creation by a Sabbath. To dwell in that Sabbath was to stand in the heart of God's time, where the soul no longer counted hours because it had become one with their source. Astronomers, too, though devoted to motion and measurement, found themselves drawn to the mystery of stillness. In their long vigils under the stars, they discovered that the heavens themselves contained moments of balance, equinoxes when light and darkness were perfectly equal, points in orbit when a planet seemed to pause before reversing its course, the still second between one celestial alignment and the next. In these pauses, they glimpsed something that no instrument could quantify: an intelligence in repose, a design resting within its own perfection. Across religions and philosophies, this silence was given many names: the seventh breath, the holy interval, the hour of no shadow. The Hebrews saw it in the Sabbath, the Buddhists in meditation, the Greeks in the moment before a note is struck. It was the same truth seen from different angles, that life is sustained not only by movement, but by the pauses that give motion meaning. Without rest, rhythm collapses into noise. To the guardians of the ancient solar scrolls, this truth was both scientific and spiritual. They observed that the natural year was not merely a cycle of seasons, but a dialogue between motion and stillness. The sun's journey paused at the solstices, the longest day and the longest night, before turning back. These pauses were holy because they mirrored the cosmic Sabbath, the divine rest built into creation itself. The world's energy exhaled, then inhaled again. Those who lived by that rhythm believed that even history followed the same law, that after every era of striving, God allowed an age of stillness, a silence in which humanity might remember what it had forgotten. In their reckoning, we now live in such an interval. The flood ended, the prophets spoke, the Messiah came, the apostles preached, the church rose, empires fell, and then silence. The last great revelation closed with John's vision on Patmos. The Lamb upon the throne, the book sealed, the countdown complete, and since then time has continued, but revelation has paused. Heaven has not spoken in thunder or fire, it has watched. The angels, one might say, have turned the page and stopped their hands above the dial, waiting for the next hour to begin. Some theologians call this the interadventum, the time between advents, the long breath between promise and fulfillment. The prophets described it as night watch, the waiting hour when the bridegroom tarries. Humanity moves, works, and wars, but all of it happens inside a divine silence, a pause so vast that most mistake it for absence. Yet in truth, this stillness may be preparation. The ancient solar keepers would say that we are living between hours, that history has reached the equinox of its final day, and that the next tick of heaven's clock will mark the dawn of a new creation. In monasteries and observatories alike, this idea persists. The monks who chant their psalms at matins, the astronomers who measure pulsars 1,000 light years away. Both are, in their own way, listening for that next divine signal. One listens through prayer, the other through mathematics, but both suspect that time itself carries prophecy. That every rotation, every vibration, every breath moves toward a reckoning. Even the Gregorian calendar, for all its precision, cannot escape this mystery. Pope Gregory's reform in 1582 succeeded in aligning human dates with the solar year, but it could not heal the fracture between human time and divine time. The correction was mathematical, not spiritual. The soul remained restless. Civilization learned to count the days perfectly, yet felt perpetually out of sync. We had mastered time, but lost the meaning of timing. Those who return to the ancient solar scrolls claim that this dissonance is the very reason for modern anxiety. When humanity lives out of rhythm with creation, the heart cannot rest. The machines that measure time tick without pause, but the spirit still longs for the silence between them, the sacred breath. We fill that silence with sound, with engines, with commerce, with information. Yet beneath the static, the old rhythm still beats, faint but faithful. The solstices still come, the equinoxes still balance. The sun still rests for a breath at its turning, as if reminding us that even fire must pause to remain alive. Mystics of every era have described encountering God not in the noise of worship or the fire of revelation, but in the quiet afterward. Elijah, hiding in the cave, did not hear the Lord in the wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire, but in a still, small voice. That whisper was the sound of the pause. The divine does not shout, it breathes, and in that breath lies the renewal of all things. Perhaps that is what the writers of the Dead Sea community meant when they spoke of the appointed silence of the ages. They believed that between one covenant and the next, there must always come a season of stillness, a time when humanity waits, the heavens recalibrate, and the cycle prepares to turn again. This was not despair, it was hope made patient. To them, silence was not the absence of God's voice, it was the space being cleared for it. Our modern world, with its constant motion, may be the furthest it has ever drifted from that understanding. We treat silence as emptiness, rest as inefficiency, waiting as weakness. But sacred time still operates by older laws. The heart cannot remain in perpetual motion without breaking. Every song needs a rest, every orbit a pause, every story an interlude before the final act. The prophets knew this, and so did the angels. When the book of Revelation describes heaven falling silent for about half an hour before the trumpets sound, it is describing the final stillness, the cosmic inhale before the last exhale of judgment and renewal. Perhaps that is where we are now, the half hour of heaven's silence, between the last prophecy and the next, between crucifixion and consummation, between empire and eternity. Humanity, for all its clocks and calendars, still lives inside that pause. And though we fill it with noise and ambition, it remains holy, inviolate, waiting for the sound that will begin the next divine hour. Those who study the old pattern say the signs are already aligning, the seasons shifting back toward their appointed places, the sun and moon nearing the balance once lost. They do not predict apocalypse. They speak of restoration. For in the Enochic vision, the end is never destruction. It is correction. The pause is not death. It is preparation. And so we wait. The silence between hours stretches longer than we expected, yet it hums with unseen energy like a string drawn taut before it sings. Every prayer whispered in the dark, every act of faith performed in patience, is part of that tension, a note waiting for its resolution. The ancient teachers said that when the next hour begins, the world will not end in chaos, but in clarity. The bells of heaven will ring, not as alarm, but as harmony restored. The dissonance will resolve. The Creator's rhythm will flood through creation again, and time itself will breathe for the first time since Eden. Until then, we live in the pause, the space between what was and what will be. It is the hardest place to dwell, and yet the holiest. For in the silence between hours, eternity waits, listening to see if creation still remembers the sound of its own heartbeat. All calendars, no matter how precise, end in uncertainty. Every timeline, whether carved in stone or computed by stars, eventually arrives at the same threshold. A moment that cannot be measured, only awaited. The ancients called it the appointed time. The prophets called it the day of the Lord. Enoch called it the renewal of the luminaries, and every civilization, from the builders of ziggurats to the watchers of observatories, has looked for it. That instant when the cosmic clock wound at creation strikes again. From the beginning, this expectation has pulsed beneath every age like a second heartbeat. Each generation feels the tremor of anticipation, sensing that time itself is not endless motion, but an approaching conclusion. Not an ending of existence, but a restoration of order. Just as night yields to dawn and winter to spring, so too, they believed, would the ages turn until light fully overtook the darkness once more. Enoch's vision called this moment the renewal of the luminaries, the time when the sun and moon would again follow their perfect paths, the stars realigned to their ancient gates and the rhythm of heaven restored. It was not the destruction of the world, but its harmonization, the great resetting of the clock. What modern science calls precession. The slow, grand shift of the Earth's axis through the constellations over millennia. The ancients saw as the breathing of creation itself. Each age was a step in that cosmic inhale and exhale. When the axis completed its circle, when the stars returned to their original houses, the world would awaken anew. Across cultures, echoes of this teaching endured. The Egyptians spoke of Zep-Tepi, the first time, when gods walked with men, a golden age that would someday return when the stars realigned. The Hindus called it Maha Yuga, the great cycle of cosmic ages culminating in renewal. The Mayans spoke of the great Baktun turns when the calendar wheel would complete and begin again. Even modern astronomers, tracing the slow wobble of the planet, mark the passing of astrological ages, from Taurus to Aries, Aries to Pisces, and now toward Aquarius, unaware that they are describing the same pattern that Enoch saw when Uriel guided him through the gates of the heavens. But for the prophets of Israel, the renewal of the luminaries was not just astronomy, it was covenant. They believed that history itself was a clock, a sacred sequence of sevens leading toward redemption. From creation to the flood, from the Exodus to the exile, from the first temple to the final revelation, every era moved according to a divine cadence. When Daniel spoke of the time, times, and half a time, when John wrote of the 1,000 years of rest. They were not counting in human years, but in cycles. The same measures of light and shadow set in motion on the fourth day of creation. That rhythm still governs everything, whether we recognize it or not. Every sunrise, every heartbeat, every orbit is a note in the same divine composition. But humanity, lost in the noise of its own inventions, has forgotten how to hear it. The modern world keeps time with machines, atomic precision, digital seconds, ceaseless motion, yet remains deaf to the music those numbers once carried. The calendar of heaven still turns, but we no longer know when the hour changes. And yet, the signs of alignment are everywhere for those who look with both faith and reason. Astronomers observed that the great precessional cycle, roughly 26,000 years, is nearing one of its turning points. The vernal equinox is drifting once again toward the same constellations that marked the dawn of early civilizations. Solar activity rises and falls with strange regularity, matching patterns recorded by ancient sky watchers. Climate, magnetism, even human consciousness itself seem to pulse with invisible tides. Science calls it coincidence. Prophecy calls it convergence. Enoch's writings describe a moment when the luminaries would change their courses and then return to their proper places. In that restoration, he says, righteousness will shine brighter than the sun, and time itself will be healed. The book of Revelation echoes the same promise in another voice. A new heaven and a new earth, for the former things have passed away. To the modern ear, these phrases sound metaphorical, but perhaps they are not. Perhaps they describe a literal reconciliation of the cosmic and the moral, the day when creation's rhythm, long fractured by pride and rebellion, synchronizes once more with its creator. If so, then the end of time is not destruction, but harmony. The hour yet to strike is not an explosion, but a resolution. The final chord of a song that began before the stars were born. It is the moment when all dissonance fades, when the silence between hours gives way to sound again. And maybe that is why the prophets often describe the end not as terror but as music. The trumpets of revelation, the singing of the redeemed, the new song that no one had heard before. When heaven's clock chimes again, it will not be the ticking of an ending. It will be the beginning of rhythm restored. Throughout history, those who sensed this approaching alignment often described it in images of light. The early Christians spoke of the parousia, the appearing, as a dawn that would break upon a long night. The Essenes called it the age of renewal, when the sons of light would be vindicated. Islamic mystics speak of the hour, when all hidden things will be revealed. Even secular cosmologists peering through telescopes speak of entropy reversing, of order emerging from chaos. Every worldview in its own vocabulary anticipates the same thing, a return to the original harmony, the restoration of divine timing. Yet the question remains, when? It is the question that has haunted every prophet, every astronomer, every poet. The disciples asked it of Jesus, and his answer remains the same. Of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven. But perhaps the warning was not meant to discourage curiosity, but to invite readiness. To remind us that the point is not to predict the hour, but to live in tune with it. The appointed time in this view is not a date on a chart, but a condition of the soul. When creation and creator are once again in harmony, the clock will strike of its own accord. To live in expectation of that hour is to walk as the ancients did, not counting time, but keeping it. It is to notice the balance of light and dark, to honor the Sabbaths of rest, to remember that every dawn repeats the first. It is to resist the tyranny of mechanical time and return to the sacred rhythm that moves through wind, tide, and breath. Those who live this way, the mystics say, are already inhabiting eternity. For them, the renewal has begun. Perhaps that is what Enoch meant when he said, "The righteous shall shine forever, and time shall no longer be measured." Not that time will cease, but that measurement will become meaningless because every moment will be full. The angels in his vision continued their watch not to count the minutes, but to keep the music of creation in perfect harmony. Their task was not to control time, but to preserve its beauty. And in the end, that will be humanity's task as well. The story then circles back to its beginning. Before the first sunrise, time was pure, potential, a silent rhythm waiting to be heard. When light divided from darkness, the first beat sounded, and the angels marked it with awe. Since then, the clock of heaven has turned through ages of glory and grief, rebellion and redemption, silence and song. Now, as we stand at the threshold of another turning, the same question whispers through creation. Will we be ready when the hour strikes? Somewhere above the noise of civilization, the celestial metronome still ticks. The procession continues. The equinoxes still balance. The luminaries still trace their appointed paths across the sky. The angels still stand at their gates, their wings poised above the dial. And deep within the human spirit, older than memory, there remains a faint recognition, a feeling that something vast and ancient is about to move again. When that moment comes, it may not arrive with thunder or flame, but with light. The same quiet light that once divided day from night. The same breath that spoke the worlds into being. For the true sound of the final hour will not be a bell or a trumpet, but the world itself returning to tune. And when that happens, time will no longer be exile. The pause between hours will become eternal mourning. The angels will mark their rhythm once more, and the calendar of heaven, the first and last clock, will complete its circle. The story that began with light dividing darkness will end the same way, with light triumphant, rhythm restored, and humanity remembering at last how to listen.